Chapter 494. Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then he heaved a sigh of relief and stood up. Then, let's talk about another matter. He looked at Lu Gongzan. Your right arm could not be saved. The scale has my demonic energy, the demonic energy of the true state. Even if it's just a scale, it's still slowly eroding your vitality after you hit it in your flesh and blood. So, I used some tricks just now, to seal the demonic energy of the dragons in your right arm. At this point, Lu Gongzan lowered his head to look at his arm. It wasn't that he didn't notice it before, but he didn't mention it. Now that Li Yunxin mentioned it, he slowly raised his right arm and clenched it. The scale covered the back of his hand. As he clenched it, the sound of metal clashing could be heard. It was demonic, but it was very powerful. Your right arm has the demonic energy of the dragons, so it's very strong, comparable to ordinary magic weapons. Li Yunxin sighed. I had no other way, so I could only do this. I don't know if you... I like it very much. Lu Gongzan smiled. It's a good arm. It's both an arm and a divine weapon. Brother Xang, give it a name. Li Yunxin was silent for a while. He exhaled lightly and suddenly smiled. Let's call it Qilin arm, Lu Gongzan thought for a while. It's a good arm and a good name. After saying this, he slowly stood up and moved his arms and legs. He said in a low voice, it's still a little sore, but I'm full of energy. What does Brother Xian want to do next? After being imprisoned here for so long, my old bones are also itching. But Li Yunxin didn't move. He only looked at him. Don't be anxious. There's one more thing. The vitality in your body was originally going to be cut off. In order to save your life, I randomly gave you a handful of pills. I didn't ask for any medicinal properties, just the spiritual energy inside. You feel energetic now, but the spiritual energy is supporting you. If the spiritual energy dissipates, you won't be able to live. We'll save your life first, then we'll do other things. When he said this, Lu Gongzan smiled and was about to say something. But Li Yunxin waved his hand. I know what you're going to say. But since we're on Cloud Mountain now, it's not difficult to save your life, as long as I enter Cloud Mountain first. After saying this, he turned to look at the sword cultivator outside the prison cell. The swordsman himself had become deaf. He was shivering in pain, but he didn't dare to groan. He just stood there as if his feet were rooted to the ground. Li Yunxin looked at him sternly and ordered, "Open the door." These words directly bombarded into the sword cultivator's spiritual sense. However, this kind of sound transmission method was simple and crude, and it was harmful to one's divine sense. Li Yunxin was at the perfected master realm. When she spoke in such a manner, the sword cultivator only felt his head buzzing. It was as if a god was speaking with the sound of thunder. Every sentence he heard made him dizzy. He knew that Li Yunxin didn't need him to open the door. But when he heard Li Su's words, he was relieved. If Li Su wanted to kill him, he probably wouldn't be so long-winded. But now, Li Su told him to do this and that. Obviously, Li Su didn't want to kill him. But when he heard Li Su's words, he was relieved. If Li Su wanted to kill him, he probably wouldn't be so long-winded. But Li Su told him to do this and that. Obviously, Li Su didn't want to kill him. As for opening the door, Li Su wanted to order him around and show off his power. So he endured the pain in his head, took out the key and opened the door. Instead, he said, "Let me ask you first, do you know where the other person is imprisoned?" If an ordinary cultivator were to encounter such a situation and face such a demon, they would definitely be at a loss for what to do after poking their ears and feeling dizzy. But this sword cultivator seemed to be smarter than ordinary people. Hearing Li Yunxin's question rumbling in his mind, he only paused for a moment before replying, I know. The Dragon King is talking about another demon cultivator, a chicken spirit. I know where he is, he's not far from here. Li Yunxin said, lead the way. The sword cultivator didn't dare to say anything else. He turned around and led the way. Li Yunxin followed him. Lu Gongzan thought for a while and slowly followed. This place was used to imprison prisoners. Wide and cold stone paths connected the cells. They were illuminated by talismans that didn't have much spiritual power. The three of them walked on the stone path. Their footsteps echoed far away. After about half an incense stick of time, Li Yunxin said, I'll kill you here. But he didn't say it with his spiritual sense. The sword cultivator didn't notice and didn't stop. Lu Gongzan was stunned. He said in a low voice, Brother Xin? Li Yunxin slowed down her pace and walked alongside Lu Gongzan. If he doesn't behave in a moment, you take action and kill him. If you meet other cultivators below the realm of truth, you can kill them. Your Qilin arm is impervious to fire and water. I'll be behind you in such a narrow place. No one will be a match for you. Lu Gongzan frowned. He knew that Li Yunxin's shout was to test the sword cultivator to see if he was deaf or not. And now he said something like this, I'm only in the realm now. I don't have any demon power. Li Yunxin said softly, I had a guess about the body possession after death. He said slowly while walking, since the body is destroyed and the body is possessed by the incarnation, and the incarnation is a projection, it might have some effect. I didn't notice it in the city of Wei, but I felt it on the battlefield. After the third time. I'm finally sure. As he spoke, he raised his hand and rubbed it hard on his face. After his first possession, he still looked like Li Yunxin. His appearance had matured early, and he looked 18 or 19 at the age of 15 or 16. He looked like a handsome and devilishly handsome young man. The second time he was resurrected on the battlefield, his appearance didn't change, but he looked more fresh and tender. His skin was like a newborn baby's. If any mortal woman in the world saw him, they would probably feel ashamed of themselves and think that their skin was rotten. Now, after the third possession, his skin was even more delicate and smooth. Now he rubbed his face hard and put his hand down. His face immediately turned red. But it was not a healthy red. It looked like it had been exposed to the sun or hit hard. After another breath of time, the red color gradually turned green, and then into a deep purple. Under the skin of his face, he rubbed it until it bled. Lu Gongzan was shocked and whispered, How can this be? He had been with Li Yunxin for a long time, so he knew a lot about demons. For example, this dragon child was not an ordinary animal to begin with. He was formed by the dragon's soul and the demon's primordial qi. He had no original form. Whether it was the human form, the demon form, or the real body, they could all be seen as different forms of the original form. Because of this, once the spirit was damaged or weakened, it would show on the face. Li Yunxin's body had always been strong. A knife couldn't even cut an eyelash. But now he just rubbed his face with his hand, and blood appeared. Many have died. I guess the spirit is damaged. Li Yunxin whispered, After the possession there is no demon power, only the realm. Originally, without demon power only the body is strong, but now it seems that there is something wrong with the body. But, it's just a matter of face. The phrase, a matter of face, was ambiguous and could be interpreted in any way. But just as Lu Gongzan was puzzled, Li Yunxin raised her hand again. A few fingers of her right hand turned into the form of a demon, and her nails became sharp. Then he used his fingernails to scratch the blood, and cut off half the size of a palm. Lu Gongzan's scalp tightened and he almost felt his face hurt. But the skin peeled off, but there was no blood. Below it was the skin of a newborn baby, very smooth and tender. Li Yunxin rubbed the skin in his hand and it turned into powder. Now it's easy to lose the skin, but it's not a big problem. But before I recover my demon power, I'm afraid that people will see through me. So if anything happens, I will have to rely on you. Lu Laodao listened to him and nodded. Then he sighed, Brother X, and you can't die again. Something happens. Li Yunxin smiled, Okay. If I die again today, I won't die again. Lu Gongzan was stunned again and he didn't understand what he meant. The swordsman in front stopped, turned around and looked at Li Yunxin and Lu Gongzan. We're here. When he spoke, he looked a little panicked, and it seemed that he was trying his best to stay awake. After saying this, he stepped aside, and a stone room appeared next to him. The place where Shanji was imprisoned was not far from the place where Lu Gongzan was imprisoned, and the cell was also the same. But the person lying on the ground looked more miserable than Lu Gongzan. He was lying on the stone floor, motionless. His left arm was gone, and there were white bones at the broken part. A pool of black blood flowed on the ground, and it had already scabbed. No one knew how long he had been lying like this. His hair was messy and half of his face was covered, but his face could be vaguely seen. He was indeed a chicken spirit. His body didn't move and no one knew whether he was dead or alive. Seeing this, Li Yunxin pursed his lips and stopped. Lu Gongzan strode forward, grabbed the cell door with his right hand, and tore it open with a bit of force. Then he walked in, squatted down and put his hand on his neck for a while. He turned to look at Li Yunxin. He has 6 hours at most. Li Yunxin was silent for a while, and then he turned to look at the swordsman. Do you know where Bai Yunxin and Red Lady are? The swordsman was stunned for a while. This? I don't know. But, then do you know where Xan Shilio is? The swordsman was even more stunned. Xan Shilio? Who is she? Li Yunxin walked over and said, Okay. It's none of your business. Then you stay here and take good care of them. The swordsman was slightly relieved. Dragon King, don't worry. Li Yunxin suddenly raised his hand and hit his head with his palm. The swordsman reacted and raised his sword to block. But there was a sound of metal cracking. The sword was smashed and the bones were broken, the arms and head were smashed. The swordsman fell to the ground without a sound. A remnant soul slowly stood up from the corpse. Li Yunxin breathed a sigh of relief, bowed his head and rubbed his palm, so the wound caused by the broken sword healed quickly. He squatted down, dipped his hand in the swordsman's blood, drew a few lines on the ground and breathed again. The remnant soul suddenly opened its eyes wide, and slowly appeared, looking no different from the previous swordsman. Li Yunxin glanced at Pheasant and said to Lu Gongzan, "Let him deal with the corpse. It can hold on for a while. Wait for me here, I'll save you in 6 hours." Without waiting for Lu Gongzan's reply, he flew off into the distance. Chapter 495. The two pseudo-sages seemed to be unaware of all this. But even if they knew, compared to what was happening inside Cloud Mountain, Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia seemed to think that what was happening outside Cloud Mountain was more of a headache for them. For example, now a group of mortals crawling in front of them, shivering. Now they were in a palace which looked brilliant and extraordinarily gorgeous. This was supposed to be the style of a mortal emperor. But now, a group of detached and indifferent cultivators in this palace seemed a little out of place. But this was something that could not be helped. Cloud Mountain fell 100 miles away, and the terrible noise shook the earth violently. Without the protection of this ostentatious magic treasure, these mortals would probably be shocked to death in just a quarter of an hour. But this group of mortals was the group of people who could not die the most now. Su Yusong stared at them for a while, almost gnashing his teeth as he looked at the group of heads and heads standing in front of him. This is what you did. Yes, they were just wandering souls. Some of these wandering souls were originally guarding in the wild forest, in case the people of Munanju caused trouble before Li Yunxin died. Some were guarding the emperors and ministers of various countries, in case they killed themselves to become ghost cultivators. The original intention was to send these people to a safer place. After the war, those heads and heads who had not been possessed died or were seriously injured, and then they would completely take over the entire Shenmen Gate. But many things looked and did, were all different things. How could Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia know that they had been seen through the first time they appeared in the world? In fact, they could not be blamed. If those heads and heads still had the mind of mortals, they would never think that the two sages may not be the two sages of the past. Because mortals always had many habits and emotions. Naturally, they included things like fear and respect. These things would always blind the clear consciousness of mortals. But those masters had already abandoned most of these things. When what he saw and what he was thinking about were connected, he would directly omit a lot of miscellaneous emotions. Although this often made them appear paranoid, arbitrary, and headstrong, it also made it easier for them to get to the truth of the matter. The two pseudo-sages had never experienced this for 1,000 or even thousands of years. Now that they had experienced it for the first time, they ended up in such a sorry state. That was why he hurriedly gave the order to the wandering souls that were scattered elsewhere to immediately take care of their own affairs and return as soon as possible. The wandering souls returned in time, which showed how high the prestige of these two senior brothers and senior sisters were in their hearts. 35 wandering souls, including 9 holy masters and 24 sect leaders, all rushed back. After the cultivators of the Celestial Gate knew the truth, 7 or 8 of them left first. These people were disheartened and felt that the Celestial Gate had been destroyed. They didn't want to fight any more pointless battles, so they immediately abandoned the fruit of fate and went somewhere else to cultivate in seclusion. He walked away in an incomparably confident and decisive manner. There were also some who had chased after the two for a long time, but it was only for the sake of the Shenmen and the Dao schemes. Although Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia lacked magical powers, they still had the skin of a saint. After delaying for a long time, these wandering souls arrived. Therefore, after a series of battles, some of the masters of the Celestial Gate died, some were seriously injured, and some felt that they had done their best. Heaven's will was not something they could disobey, and the Celestial Gate had run out of strength, so they also left. In this way, in the eyes of the two pseudo-sages, apart from the fact that they were unwilling to obediently hand over their bodies but also unwilling to obediently die, these high-level cultivators were still very likable. At least they were not as difficult to deal with as Li Yunxin, who had died with great difficulty. Then the internal strife ended, and this group of people entered the battlefield again to fight with the great demons, making the already declining battle situation cheer up again, and once again forcing the demon army to a distance of hundreds of miles away from Cloud Mountain. Then, they saw the situation in front of them. When they rushed to the hall, Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia found out the wandering souls had also brought a group of mortals. There were more than 100 people in total, most of them were men and very few were women. Now they were crawling in front of the two saints of Cloud Mountain, trembling and not even daring to raise their heads. In the lives of these people before, most of them were in the position of the two saints of Cloud Mountain. They were the emperors, empresses, famous nobles and ministers of the various countries in Midland. There were 119 people in total. They had originally sent some celestial gate cultivators to watch over them. After the incident with the Qing Emperor and Emperor Yu, they felt that the celestial gate cultivators did not know how to be flexible, so they sent the wandering souls to help. Earlier, the two pseudo-sages had told them to immediately take care of their own affairs and return as quickly as possible. These wandering souls unexpectedly they captured them and brought them back. Therefore Su Yusong shouted harshly again, "Is this how you do the things I gave you? Capture all of them? What do you want me to do with them?" In the hearts of mortals, the Sendo were noble and ethereal beings. But now, these noblest people in Midland found that these Sendo in front of them not only knew how to capture people, but they also knew how to curse, beat, and even kill people. Each of them had a faint smell of blood on them. It came from the two arrogant emperors. They had been directly blasted into a bloody mist. Not even their souls were left. He was so angry that finally one of the wandering souls couldn't help but say, "Why don't you tell me what else can we do? If we leave them there, who knows if those stupid Taoist priests won't be able to keep an eye on them. The Qing Emperor and Emperor Yu are examples." After this person spoke, the other also said, "It's not good to kill them all. Didn't we kill one earlier?" We were scolded again. "Since we can't kill them or keep them, what else can we do if we don't bring them to you?" These two were talking back, but their words were full of grievance. They were not arrogant. At most they were complaining. Since this was the case, Su Yusong's anger could not explode again. 35 people had rushed over and fought with the celestial gate cultivators. In the end they lost 2 in the first encounter. Then 3 more died. Of the 35 people, only 30 remained. In total, they had only killed 1 celestial gate sect leader and heavily injured 1 sect leader. It was not good to get angry before appeasing them. Zhuomuxia sighed lightly. "Your senior brother is also angry. This matter is troublesome." When they spoke, they did not avoid the nobles at all. They just pretended they didn't understand human language. "These have been brought here. There are demons in front, and behind the formation are these people who could become demons at any time. Once something happens, it will not be a joke." The other, Zhuomuxia walked to Su Yusong's side and pulled him to sit down. He then turned to the group of wandering souls and said, "Didn't we say it before? When the celestial gate collapsed, we still had to protect the world. Now that you have captured them and the world knows, what do we do in the future?" The wandering souls seemed to have long known what the 2 false saints were thinking. They had no choice in this matter, so they didn't speak for a moment. After a moment of silence, they suddenly heard a thin female voice say from the corner, "What's so difficult about it? Kill them one by one and wait to become ghost emperors. Once they become ghost emperors, they will be imprisoned and refined into wandering souls. Then they will be sent back to be emperors and empresses. To the outside world, they will only say that the celestial gate fought against the demons. The immortals took them away and invited them to watch the battle, so that they could see the painstaking efforts of the celestial gate to raise the people. This nonsense has been said for tens of thousands of years, and they never get tired of it. What's the big deal if we continue now?" When the nobles heard this, they trembled in fear and crouched even lower. The wandering souls looked in the direction of the voice. They saw Xan Shilio covered in blood. She hugged her legs and rested her chin on her knees. She looked at the mortals faintly and said these words in a very calm tone. They also knew that this little junior sister was the favorite of their senior brother and sister. But now they found it strange. She was in such a sorry state and was no longer as clever and cheerful as before. It was as if she had seen through the world of mortals and didn't care about anything. Then they looked at their senior brother and sister. Xan Shilio said these words and looked so sorry, but the 2 of them didn't look at her. They just kept a straight face and thought for a moment. "What do you think?" The wandering souls knew that something had happened between them. But they didn't say anything and just said, "Little junior sister is right." Su Yusong's face was gloomy. "Then let's do this. Now the situation is gradually stabilizing. After watching for a day or 2, I will go back to Cloud Mountain with your senior sister. But it's not enough to just stabilize the situation. We have to kill all the demons. Since Dragon Sun is so arrogant, let them see the power of the Grand Supreme Realm. Now, let them live for a few days first. When such sinister and vicious words came out of Sendo's mouth, it immediately made the nobles understand that things were indeed not good. More than 100 people knelt down, almost covering the entire hall. Previously they had held their breath and didn't dare to breathe. Now that there was no hope in their hearts, they suddenly became noisy. But the noise only lasted for a moment. Su Yusong waved his sleeve, and these people shrank like dolls in the hands of a child and were put into his sleeve. No wonder the emperors wanted supernatural powers and longevity. Just like that, so what if they had the most power in a country? In the face of power that didn't belong to the human world, the emperor was no different from an ordinary peddler. At this moment, Xan Shilio suddenly turned to look at Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia, then looked at the group of wandering souls and said, "Reason? What reason?" This kind of thing that can be thought of with a little bit of brain is worthy of the word reason. She looked at the two fake saints with resentment. Then why do you have to refine them into wandering souls? Why don't you get someone to possess them and become emperors yourselves? And then annex those messy small vassal states, leaving only 20 to 30 lords in the world, okay? That way, our people will be the respected elders of the Shenmen in a country and the emperors who live forever. Isn't that better than giving them to some demons for nothing? In the past, the countries in the human world didn't dare to annex because the Shenmen were still there. Now that the Shenmen are gone, what's there to be afraid of? Isn't this method better than refining all these people into wandering souls? Will the elders allow it? How long will it take to refine them? She said these words in one breath, and all the wandering souls in the hall were dumbfounded. Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia's expressions became even worse, as if they knew what she was going to say next. Sure enough, your heads can't compare to Li Yunxin. Xan Shilio could no longer remain calm. It was as if there was a burning flame in her heart that had been temporarily frozen just now. But now that it was thawing bit by bit, it became even more intense. They say that you have to think about the world and achieve great things. Humph, those who achieve great things don't bother about trifles. If you really think that a person is useful, you have to use him no matter how hateful he is, not to mention that he has been refined into a wandering soul. Why would you care about what he was like in the past? Li Yunxin, you don't refine him but killed him for nothing. Now you're refining these useless things. He's right. The two of you are more suitable to plot behind the scenes. You're not suitable at all to be the rulers of the world. At this point she stood up and glared at the two saints. I'm the one who regrets being a wandering soul and being with you. As soon as she finished speaking, everyone hurriedly said, "Little junior sister, what are you saying?" Wandering souls naturally had different personalities. For a moment, some were comforting, some were resentful, some were silent, and some were thoughtful. But Su Yusong finally looked at her. He sneered. You regret being a wandering soul? Fine. Then what do you want? Her words were filled with killing intent, and her eyes were so cold that they seemed to be covered with a layer of frost. She was not in a supreme state of mind. After coming out of the mountain, she suffered setbacks again and again. She had long accumulated anger in her chest. Li Yunxin had also said that Xan Shilio was only suitable for plotting behind the scenes. But at that time they were still on Little Cloud Mountain. Su Yusong only laughed it off, knowing that it was the harsh words of someone who was about to die. But now that Xan Shilio said it in such a situation, it hurt his heart. Now the killing intent was real and the coldness in her eyes was also real. But Xan Shilio did not flinch at all. Instead she glared back. Kill me the same way you killed Li Yunxin. Everyone was shocked. Zhuomuxia could not help but turn to look at her. It seemed that he wanted to persuade her and Su Yusong. But in the end he did not say it. Su Yusong sneered. Fine. It was at this moment, when swords were drawn, two people suddenly fell through the door. This palace was also a magic treasure, not an ordinary residence that could be thrown in as one wished. So everyone turned to look at the door and saw two people. Both of them were very familiar with each other. One of them was a woman in white. It was Lu Ling. She used to be a genius in Shenmen. These wandering souls had possessed the sect leader and the sect leader, so they naturally knew about her. And the other one was Being Grandmother. She was also a wandering soul, but she walked the world all year round, so it was not always possible to see her. But they also knew that this Being Grandmother was different from them. They had possessed the bodies of the Shenmen masters and obtained their cultivation for nothing. Being Grandmother's cultivation was not obtained for nothing, but she had cultivated it herself. And it was not Daotong or Kenzo methods but the way of painting. But now, Being Grandmother was covered with blood, her face was like gold paper and she was on the verge of death. And Lu Ling fell in with her in her arms. It seemed that the two of them went all the way to the outside of this palace, and Bean grandmother opened the magic treasure before she came in. Seeing this scene, no one was not shocked. Wandering souls were extremely difficult to die. Even if the body they possessed died, the wandering soul could abandon the body and go somewhere else. But now this Bean grandmother was as weak as an ordinary person, as if the wandering soul in her body had been seriously injured and could not leave the body. Who had this kind of ability? Note 1. Something like this paragraph, in fact, is not earth-shattering, nor is it an exciting plot. It is just a side description of some characters in the novel. Perhaps many readers who see similar words in the novel will feel long-winded, or even directly skip it, and then feel a little watery. In fact, when I wrote this kind of thing, I even spent more thought than a simple fight. Because it is actually explaining the logical relationship in the novel, and perfecting the character settings. For example, why do those cultivators all look so stupid? This paragraph is actually to explain similar problems. And in the previous chapters, it has also been mentioned many times and explained a lot of their psychology. For example, because they have fewer emotions, they see things very directly. Either they are ridiculously wrong, like the overconfident Yunzi, or they hit the nail on the head, like these sect masters and sect leaders who see through the fake sage. But if there are not many such explanations, then when reading many plots, it is possible to feel that the characters' reactions are illogical and logical flaws. This will actually greatly affect the reading experience. For example, a long time ago, someone said in the book review section to abandon the book. The reason was that there is obviously a problem with the mental cultivation of these cultivators. They have cultivated into monsters and should not cultivate like this. But if this friend has seriously read the book, he will realize that the problem he raised has long been explained in the novel, and more than once. There is indeed a problem with their cultivation. So if you did not read carefully, you will have to take the blame. The most obvious example is, if a protagonist like Li Yunxin were to be placed in other books, look at what stupid things he has done. He has killed himself time and time again. Knowing that it is dangerous, he still insists on sending himself to death, and in front of the enemy he is servile. These are all very scary points. But because I used so many different aspects to make everyone realize that he was actually an extraordinary person, and that he had his own logic and reasons for doing all these stupid things, it actually felt like, once you accept this setting, it's actually quite interesting, right? So, I hope that when you read my book, you do not need to read every word and sentence, but do not skip large sections. Because what you skip may be very important information in the future. If you skip this, you may have doubts in the future, such as, how can he react like this? How can he do such things? Chapter 496. When the two of them slammed into the door, everyone was in a daze. Xian Shilio was the first one to react. She didn't have time to argue with Su Yusong anymore. She wanted to run over and see what was going on. Grandma Bean used to be a Taoist priest in Yunshan. Her temperament was the most similar to a human among all the wandering souls. When she was in Yunshan, she taught Xian Shilio a lot of painting techniques. She was one of the few wandering souls that this little demon girl didn't hate. Now that she had lost Li Yunxin was a disciple of the art Taoism. She loved the house and its crow, so her impression of Do Po was even worse. She was worried. But she had only taken 2 steps when Lu Ling had already picked up Do Po, calling out repeatedly, "Granny, Granny. If you have something to say, say it quickly. She's here, she's here." Everyone knew that Lu Ling lost her supernatural power because of Li Yunxin's scheme. Later she got a body from Li Yunxin and became an ordinary person. Now she looked at her. She didn't have the elegance of a cultivator anymore. Instead, she looked like an ordinary woman. Tears flowed out of her eyes as she shouted. She couldn't help but admire Grandma Bean's skill. In just a few days she had tamed this little girl. However, Do Po was being carried in her arms, being tossed around and rubbed. Originally she was a little angry and wanted to say something, but now how could she say anything? With his lips trembling, he reached out a hand to grab Lu Ling's shoulder tightly and stared at her. Seeing this, Su Yusong frowned. With just one step, he appeared in front of the two of them. He didn't ask Lu Ling. He just put a finger on Grandma Bean's forehead. Then his face changed. Grandma Bean made a ho-ho sound again. She stared at Su Yusong. Lu Ling cried, "Grandma, Grandma, if you have something to say, say it quickly." But Grandmother Bean was already slowly losing her breath. She was like an ordinary old man with a serious illness in the secular world. She was about to die. Seeing this, Lu Ling cried to Su Yusong again. Grandma was hurt by a man who looked like a skeleton. He was very tall and came out of nowhere. After crying for a while, she shook the bean lady. Granny, Granny, Grandpa Saint is here. Tell me. At this time, Xian Shilio also came over. She grabbed Lu Ling's hair and pulled her aside. She scolded her sternly. What are you screaming for? You shook a perfectly fine person to death. Lu Ling was now immortal. A cultivator of the transcendent state like Xian Shilio was like a god to her. There was no room for her to resist. She was immediately thrown to the side, and her hair was undone, draping over her face. He didn't dare to come over and could only lie on the side and watch as Bean grandmother cried. After tearing Lu Ling apart, Xian Shilio bent down and touched Grandmother Bean's forehead. Then her face turned pale like Su Yusong's. But she was only stunned for a short while, and then she immediately turned and stared at Lu Ling. What do you mean by a skeleton? Where is he? How did he get hurt? It was not that she and Su Yusong did not want to save Grandmother Bean. But there was no way to save her. If a whole wandering soul was regarded as a mass of primordial qi, then Grandmother Bean's qi was now very weak. More than half of his soul had disappeared, as if it had been bitten and eaten by a monster. The wandering souls had never encountered such a situation. No wonder even Su Yusong was stunned. At this time Lu Ling could only cry. But at least she knew how to speak. I was sleeping and Popo was watching over me. When I woke up I saw Popo lying on the ground and that man walking away. Popo said that she had fought with him and knew that it was. At this point she paused, opened her mouth, tilted her head and fainted. Xian Shilio was so angry that she jumped up. From the moment she entered the door, she had been shouting and crying instead of talking properly. Now she suddenly fainted at the crucial point. She was so hateful. She already had some resentment in her heart, but now it was all aroused by Lu Ling. She raised her eyebrows and was about to kill her with one palm, take out her soul, destroy her mind, and interrogate her carefully. But when she was about to do it, she heard someone say, "Stop." It was Zhuomuxia who spoke. After saying this, he walked over in 2 steps. But he did not look at Grandmother Bean, but bent down and held Lu Ling in his arms. At that very moment, Xian Shilio's expression changed. She knew what Zhuomuxia's expression and action meant. Zhuomuxia held Lu Ling in his arms, and the other hand gently stroked her cheek, brushing away the messy black hair on her face. Then he slowly untied her belt and lifted the lapel. Then he lifted the bottom 2 layers, revealing her undergarments. Then he took off her undergarments, revealing the girl's snow-white and delicate skin, and a burst of hot air mixed with her body fragrance. Then he saw a large bruise on her left chest. Above her left breast it was red and black. If an ordinary martial arts practitioner saw this injury, he would definitely exclaim, "She was injured by a heavy method, and there is no cure for it in the world." Zhuomuxia looked at the injury and covered her clothes again. He sighed softly, turned his face and said, "Alas! This child is also seriously injured." In the end she still managed to send Grandmother Bean back. It can be seen that she is a person who understands friendship. He turned his face but did not look at Xian Shilio. Instead he regarded Xian Shilio as heir and looked at Su Yusong. Xian Shilio's expression changed dramatically. Naturally she knew that Zhuomuxia was a man in the secular world who was tired of a woman would fall in love with a new person in the blink of an eye, so the new person was called a new lover. But now this wandering soul couple was tired of Xian Shilio, and their obsession was so strong that they suddenly fell in love with Lu Ling. What was it called? Li Yunxin was right. Li Yunxin was right. The person they doted on was not Xian Shilio. What they really doted on was the feeling of doting on someone and being doted on and loved by someone. That person could be anyone. Thinking of this, thinking of Li Yunxin and seeing Zhuomuxia holding Lu Ling in his arms, Xian Shilio felt sad. But in the end she just clenched her teeth, snorted and slowly retreated to the previous corner, hugged her legs and sat down. When Su Yusong saw Zhuomuxia's appearance, his originally livid face slowly eased. After a moment of silence, he looked down at Grandmother Bean. At this moment, Grandmother Bean's eyes were already lifeless. The whites of her eyes quickly became turbid, and her face quickly aged. Soon she turned into a dried corpse. The whole process was unbelievably fast. It was also a situation that had never been seen before. Since he could not get anything out of her, Su Yusong's gaze fell on Lu Ling. Then he said, "Before, when this kid didn't know who we were, I liked her quite a lot." Pausing for a second, he seemed to sigh in a low voice. "When she was in the Cloud Mountain, I summoned her and gave her many treasures. Back then the world was still ours. Back then the Cloud Mountain was prosperous." In the end he should have this sigh. Back then the Gate of Wonders was in their hands and the world was in their hands. All spirit creatures were hiding and dared not to make any trouble. Everything in Midland was in good order, and the hearts of Wuxia and Wuxia were full of hope, pride, and confidence. But it was only a few months. The Gate of Wonders was broken, and spirit creatures attacked to the foot of the Cloud Mountain. Many wandering souls died, and Wuxia realized that many things weren't as easy as they looked. Although all of this was facilitated by the Freemasons in the dark, and they couldn't blame anyone, seeing the beautiful thing that once belonged to them being destroyed really made them feel all sorts of emotions, and they couldn't help but sigh. Hearing him, Wuxia said, "So, good." Su Yusong sighed slightly. "So, she doesn't need to be immortal anymore. I'll keep her alive. When she wakes up, we'll ask her what happened. But in my opinion, it should be the spirit creatures over there. Spirit creatures are born with different abilities which can't be explained by magic. But I don't know which spirit creature has such a strange ability. A so, and a good, everyone knew what it meant. It meant that they were going to turn this Lu Ling into a wandering soul. To refine, these two new darlings. No matter what the two saints thought, this meant that they had a new member. Therefore the group of wandering souls in the hall also became happy. Earlier, when Lu Ling slammed into the door, their faces were full of coldness. But now they all gathered around Wuxia, looking at the unconscious Lu Ling, clicking their tongues happily. But in the eyes of others, this scene was a bit scary. It was like a group of devils discussing how to share the flesh of a baby. Everyone was happy and no one paid attention to Xian Shilio anymore. Xian Shilio gritted her teeth and looked at them. She put her hand into her sleeve and took out a painting. It was the one that Li Yunxin had given to Lu Gongzan, drinking wine and Pei Di. And at this time the owner of this painting walked to a fork in the road. Li Yunxin had imagined the size of Cloud Mountain and the complexity of its internal passages. However, he didn't expect it to be so complicated and grand. He thought, it should be similar to the stone road he took to Mount Shaoyin. It should be connected by many long tunnels that could accommodate several people walking side by side and several people high. There was either a wide hall or a stone chamber on either side of it. Many of these tunnels were intertwined, forming a complex and enormous nest that resembled an ant's nest. But now he knew, his guess about the structure of Cloud Mountain was correct. But his guess about the scale was wrong. For example, what he saw now, in fact he should be in a big canyon. The bottom of the canyon was flat and it was hundreds of steps wide. It was hard to find a suitable analogy for this width in this world. But in his previous world it should be said, it was the length of a standard football field. Length not width. Such a wide canyon, on both sides, there were rock walls of the same height extending upward, and finally converging at the top. In fact, the cross-section was like a lying oval. At the bottom there were fallen weeds, slightly undulating terrain, clusters of bushes and woods. The stone walls on both sides were also covered with vines, trees and weeds. Some plants climbed all the way to the top. And they bore fruit. He didn't know whether the fruit was a natural mutation or the blessing of talismans, but it actually glowed. So the densely packed fruit hung on the top of his head, stretching from one end of his sight to the other, looking like a brilliant galaxy. Naturally, the canyon was lit up as if it was night. Li Yunxi knew that this was not a passage. It was more like a natural environment with a complete biological community. There were more similar huge passages extending in the Cloud Mountain. The entire Cloud Mountain was not filled with people, sects, or cold stone rooms as he had thought before. In fact, most of the space here was a natural landscape, and people's residences only occupied a small part of it. No wonder cultivators didn't want to go to the Cloud Mountain. Except for the vast mountains and rivers, almost everything in the mortal world could be found on the Cloud Mountain. Such a huge thing could actually cruise in the air for tens of thousands of years in the Midland without disintegrating. Perhaps only divine beings could do that. However, this level of situation also caused his original plan to fall through. His original plan, for example, in a narrow passage. Although there weren't many people coming and going in the passage, at least there would be people passing by occasionally. He randomly grabbed someone on the road, and used some random method to ask about the location of the Cloud Mountain, the cave residence, and the secret location. If he couldn't get one answer he would ask a few more and finally he would arrive at his destination smoothly. But now he realized that this place was like a wilderness. He had been walking for nearly an hour, but he didn't see a single person. But he saw many wild animals and they weren't afraid of people at all. It was obvious that there weren't many people in this kind of place. It was really strange. The incomparably intelligent Wei River Dragon King Li Yunxin tried so hard to deceive all the powerful beings in the world, and then successfully sneaked behind the enemies, intending to take drastic measures. But he got lost. Who would believe this kind of plot? If a storyteller wrote something like this, he would probably be laughed at. The translucent jade slip should have been placed in the cloud mountain with the other treasures. The two wandering souls couldn't open it, so they definitely wouldn't carry it with them. But just like all the treasures he had handed over in the study, trying to use as signals, signposts, and guides at this time, he couldn't sense them anymore. This meant that the special inhibition of the cloud mountain had also blocked the auras of those things. Now in front of him, to the left, the wild land in late autumn suddenly turned into the lush greenery in midsummer. The wide canyon on the left was filled with lush greenery. He didn't know where the light came from, but it was the same as the sunlight, like a summer afternoon. To the right there was a shallow stream. The shallow stream had white sand banks and beautiful and slender green grass grew on the banks. The two walls were covered with furry green moss, and occasionally there were small white flowers or water flowed along the stone walls. But the entire top of the canyon was slowly dripping water, as if it was a cloudy day and it was drizzling. Whether it was to the left or to the right, it would make people feel relaxed and happy in the secular world. But now in Li Yunxin's eyes he only felt that it was strange. Everything was too different from what he had imagined. It seemed that under the quiet and peaceful appearance, there was hidden danger. At this moment, Li Yunxin heard a voice, someone calling him. He almost thought that his spirit was too heavily injured and he was hearing things. Hee. Is the king lost? Where did the king go? Chapter 497. The voice came from the left, on the other side of the white sand bank of the shallow stream where it was drizzling. The voice was shrill and thin as if it was a strange ghost speaking, but also like a cat. The voice was also very familiar. The first time he heard it, it said, "Where did you come from? How dare you behave atrociously in my palace?" If it wasn't an auditory hallucination, it was Sanhua's voice. At this moment, Li Yunxin suddenly pursed his lips, tensed his body, and looked in the direction of the voice. It was impossible. Sanhua couldn't have appeared in such a place. Before Li Yunxin and Lu Gongzan were bombarded by the godly thunder of the ninth heaven, Sanhua, Shuk, and Sky went to Baijindu with Sanhua. At that time, Li Yunxin said that he wanted to establish a little demon protection association. Lu Gongzan was very interested, so he sent the three of them there to collect the little demons. Because at that time, Li Yunxin was a little suspicious of Sanhua. For example, in the alley of the city of Wei, when she possessed the dragon lady and attacked, it was obvious that she wasn't a wandering ghost. It seemed that she had a background. However, in the end he still looked like a lunatic. She also saved Li Yunxin's life, so he didn't think too much about it at that time. In this world, who didn't have a past and a secret? If you had to find out everyone's background before you could use them, then there was no need to do anything. Moreover, his suspicions were merely about her background, and he did not think of anything worse. But the three of them went to Baijindu and then Mount Jun was attacked. In order to keep him, Lu Gongzan decisively gave up the three demons. In his heart, the three demons couldn't compare to Li Yunxin. After that, Shuk and Sky were killed, but Sanhua escaped, and there had been no news of her since. But he heard her voice here. On Cloud Mountain. The absurdity in Li Yunxin's heart was far greater than any previous similar experience. In fact, he was more willing to believe that his soul was damaged. But the next moment he saw it. Although this is a shallow stream. But the shallowness of a stream was relative to a river. How shallow could a stream that was half the width of a football field be? On both sides he could clearly see water plants, white sand, pebbles, transparent shrimp, and swimming fish. But the deeper they went, the deeper the water became. In front of him was the white beach and 15 steps away was the deep water. Thus, a ripple suddenly appeared in the deep water. Then a furry head popped out of the water and shook its head fiercely. For a moment, water splashed everywhere. It was the head of a cat. White head. There was a little yellow above his lips, 2 yellow spots on his forehead, and a little black on the tip of his nose. It had golden eyes and a white beard. It was a female cat with 3 flowers. Beads of water hung from his long beard, making him look handsome and majestic. Then the cat swam with its head held high and soon reached the shallow water. It jumped nimbly onto a rock sticking out of the water, arched its body and shook off the water on its body before sitting down. Its front paws were placed in front of its body, and it tilted its head to look at Li Yunxin. As soon as it opened its mouth, it spoke in human language. Where did the king go? Li Yunxin stared at her silently, watching her tail flapping around him unhurriedly. Seeing that he did not speak, Sanhua began to lick its paws. While licking, it used its front paws to wash its face and ears. It was very busy. It was a familiar tone and voice. If it was anywhere on the ground, Li Yunxin would be convinced that this was the Sanhua he knew. However, on Cloud Mountain he took 2 steps forward and stood still. He frowned slightly. Why are you here? Sanhua put down its paws and happily patted its tail. I was brought up. King, look at me, isn't my body beautiful? Li Yunxin took 2 more steps forward and looked at her. Shiny with a long and neat beard. What a beautiful Sanhua. Then he said, who brought you up? Sanhua was very happy to be praised by him. Suddenly it rolled on the rock. With its belly facing the sky, it raised its little face and looked at Li Yunxin with yellow eyes. Qingkangzi? Ba Mingjinzi? Mingjinzi. He brought me up. Li Yunxin was slightly stunned. He did not expect that she would say these 2 names. Qingkangzi, the leader of the 9 Heavens Divine Thunder sect. When Li Yunxin was attacked on Cloud Mountain, the cultivators used Qingkangzi's magic weapon. Later, when Li Yunxin escaped, he chased after him alone and was tortured and killed by Li Yunxin in the wild forest. Before that, he also went to Baijindu. It was he who killed the 2 demons, Shuk and Siji. Mingjinzi was the leader of the Ling Shao sword sect. He was the one who took away Lu Gongzan and took away Li Yunxin's folding fan that day. Li Yunxin was a rare smart person in the world, and his thinking was also surprisingly open and bold. As the saying goes, a mental patient has a broad mind, so because of these 2 names, a deduction was made. Combined with these 2 names and the facts of that day, there seemed to be such a possibility. Qingkangzi went to Baijindu to kill 3 demons but only killed 2. Sanhua must have used some method to get into his body without being noticed. Then Qingkangzi returned to Mount Jun and met Mingjinzi again. At that time, Mingjinzi had the spirit map that Li Yunxin painted the scenery of the city of Wei. Or, when she had an idea she would say it. This was Li Yunxin's usual bold style. He frowned. You got into Qingkangzi's body. Then you ran into Mingjinzi's spirit map. After that, Mingjinzi came to Cloud Mountain. You came out of the spirit map and stayed here? Sanhua was happy. Huh? Your Majesty said it well. Well said. It seemed that he guessed right. But it wasn't all a guess. In fact, there were many clues before. Li Yunxin just put them together. The reason why he dared to guess that Sanhua got into Qingkangzi's body without being noticed was that there was no way for Sanhua to get in touch with the Mingjinzi she mentioned. It was also because Sanhua seemed to be very good at this and was not noticed. The first time Li Yunxin saw her was in the ruined Mrs. Sanhua temple. At that time he also met the Emptiness Realm swordsman of Kenzo. At that time Sanhua's demonic power was low, but she stayed in the temple in the forest for a long time. The Emptiness Realm swordsman was also nearby, but he did not notice her. After that, when Li Yunxin interacted with her, she would often discover that this little demon was playing around her when she wasn't paying attention, and it wasn't just once. At that time he thought, the cat demon is very dexterous. However, it was still difficult to explain this matter with just this one point. Qingkangzi was a perfected master and a sect master. Sanhua was just an Emptiness Realm demon. There was almost no reasonable explanation for an Emptiness Realm demon to get into the body of a perfected master without noticing. Li Yunxin casually made up such a conjecture and Sanhua said, well said. In fact, it was more like, a random reason or excuse was enough. He said it and she agreed, so the matter was over and everyone was happy. There was no need to delve deeper into why Sanhua came here. He just had to accept the result. Was this the thoughts of this strange and shrill calico cat in front of him? If it was, then Li Yunxin realized that another possibility might also come true. It might not be a coincidence that he met Sanhua. Therefore he took a deep breath and thought of another matter. Earlier, when Lu Gongzan was in Yunshan, he had sent him a message about Jin Guangzi accepting a Taoist weapon and going to find Li Yunxin for revenge. At Juanshang, Lu Gongzan was taken away by Mingjinzi. Later, in the Battle of Changji Town, he was taken away by Jin Guangzi before Mingjinzi died. Jin Guangzi was seriously injured and returned to Yunshan, so he brought Lu Gongzan here as well. Originally he thought he was a prisoner, but news came out. Li Yunxin was very surprised. But at that time he was in a dangerous situation and didn't think too much. When he received the news, it was in Manwan Mountain before he met Ding Min and the others. At that time, it was a hunter in the mountain who called himself Mu Nanju who passed the message to him. Earlier, when Li Yunxin met Lu Gongzan, he asked him about the situation when they walked to the place where the pheasant was kept. Lu Gongzan told Li Yunxin how he received the news and how he passed it on. He mentioned a detail in the conversation. At that time he didn't care. Now that he saw Sanhua, he realized that the detail was unusual. Lu Gongzan said that he was indeed on Yunshan Mountain at the time, in the Yunshan station of the Wuji sword sect. No one paid special attention to him anymore, so he had some freedom of movement. One night he suddenly heard someone talking on the other side of the wall. The tone and voice were similar to Sanhua's. Lu Gongzan knew that it was impossible for Sanhua to appear on Yunshan Mountain, so he realized that perhaps it was someone from Munanju. The people there knew a lot of things. If they imitated Sanhua's appearance, he would know what they meant. He tried to sound him out with a few casual questions. The Munanju man, whom he had never met before, only pretended to be one of the three flowers. He also casually told him some small details about their interactions with Li Yunxin. At this point, how could he not believe that it was indeed someone from Munanju who pretended to be in contact with him? Therefore, in this situation where both sides knew, Lu Gongzan told the person that Golden Light had obtained a Taoist instrument. He did not expect that the news would really spread. When Lu Gongzan mentioned this, Li Yunxin thought, "This is wonderful." He did not need to reveal his identity. He only pretended to be a Sanhua that Lu Gongzan was familiar with, and his disguise was flawless. On the one hand, he showed his strong ability to obtain information. On the other hand, he used the most barbaric and direct way to dispel Lu Laodao's doubts. If he knew all this, why would he need to test him if he was from Shenmen? But now that he saw the beautiful tricolor cat that was possessed by the tricolor flower, he realized, maybe that night was not someone from Munanju pretending to be Sanhua. Moreover, it was indeed hers. He narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Were you the one who talked to Lu Gongzan before?" The three flowers were still cute, eccentric and mischievous at the same time. But if she did all these things or someone instructed her to do it, including saving Li Yunxin from danger for the first time, then he could no longer see her as just a little demon. Sanhua rolled over and stared at him without blinking. "Ah, that's right." Li Yunxin was silent for a while. "Who told you to do it?" The cat monster blinked and tilted her head to look at him. Her pupils narrowed into two thin black lines. "Hee, it's the second shopkeeper." "Oh, the second shopkeeper." Of course, Li Yunxin did not know who the second shopkeeper was. But he knew which kind of people liked to use this kind of name, Munanju. What Sanhua meant was, back then it was the people from Munanju who asked her to ask Lu Gongzan. Then she got the news and spread the news. In fact, there were still many things that needed to be asked, if she wanted to ask. But now Li Yunxin seemed to be sure of one thing. It should not be a coincidence that Sanhua met him. At this time, he seemed to have successfully hidden from the eyes of most people in the world. But there were still some people who were not fooled by him. These people might be allies or they might be allies for the time being. But this feeling still made Li Yunxin frown. From the beginning to the end, he had always hated the feeling that someone thought they could be superior to him, manipulating him. The two wandering souls of Cloud Mountain used to think so Li Yunxin spent a lot of effort to escape from their sight and tried to create some trouble for them. But now, no matter who knew he was still alive, they did not seem to have learned anything from what he did to Su Yusong and Zhuomuja. Li Yunxin was silent. Then he laughed. If Lu Gongzan saw him laughing, he would know that it meant that he was very angry. So much so that he laughed. "Okay." Li Yunxin smiled kindly and said, "Good cat. So, how did you find me now?" "Well, forget it. There is no point in asking this. What are you going to do now that you have found me?" Sanhua seemed to be unable to understand the meaning in Li Yunxin's smile. She stood up on the rock, arched her body and stretched. "Ah, my king is lost." "Well, where are you going, my king?" "I want to go to Cloud Mountain," said Li Yunxin. He stopped asking questions and seemed to have accepted everything. "Do you know where it is?" Sanhua happily jumped off the rock and stepped on the water to get to the shore. She stretched her feet to shake off the white sand on the soles of her feet, ran to Li Yunxin's feet and rubbed against him. I know, my king. I will take you." "Oh, go. You are very familiar with Cloud Mountain." Sanhua began to run. She ran along the stream at a fast speed, leaving shallow, plum-shaped paw prints on the white sand. Li Yunxin followed closely behind, silently observing her and everything around him. He suddenly felt like he was still in the net. He had escaped from Su Yusong and Zhuomuja's net, but then he realized that they were actually in another, bigger net. He really hoped that it was an illusion. Because even a crazy person like him didn't really like the life and death struggle part of the plot. Chapter 498. About half an hour later, Li Yunxin and Sanhua passed another fork in the road. The road ahead had its ups and downs, but it looked like gentle slopes and hills on the plain. However, when they looked at the fork in the road ahead, they saw a passage going up. It was as wide as the canyon that Li Yunxin was in. There was a long stone staircase in the middle, about 6 or 7 people walking side by side. It was paved with white marble and went up along the slope-like passage. Li Yunxin couldn't see where it went. After all, the top was not the sky, but the stone roof of the canyon. However, the top of this road was nothing but clouds. The clouds rolled slightly, emitting a golden light that illuminated the passageway brilliantly. It looked like an immortal's home. This was the first man-made trace that Li Yunxin saw after walking around for so long. In fact, it was the mountain gate of a Daotong cultivation sect. This majestic passageway should be the path to the sect. It was just that the mountain road in the secular world was a staircase on the mountain, and there were always plants on both sides. However, the two sides of the white marble staircase on this road were still flat, long slopes, on which all kinds of strange flowers and plants were embossed. When Sanhua walked here, her footsteps gradually slowed down. Then she stopped at the entrance of the mountain gate, lowered her body, suddenly pressing down her ears, revealing 2 canine teeth, and fiercely hissed. Li Yunxin knew that this was the appearance of a cat when it was angry. After all, Sanhua was not a simple cat, but she also used this way to express her emotions. If she didn't do it on purpose, it seemed to mean that after Mrs. Sanhua possessed this cat, her temperament also merged with the animal nature in the cat's body. This was very interesting. However, he still didn't know what she was angry about, until she squinted her eyes again, turned her head to look at Li Yunxin and said in a soft voice, "My king?" Shangqing Danding sect. Li Yunxin's expression froze, and he also stopped walking. The corner of his mouth was slightly pressed down. There were many people who had offended him. Some of them he could afford to offend, so they all ended badly. There were some people that he could not afford to offend, but he was a narrow-minded person who would never forget his hatred. He had always kept it in mind, waiting for the right moment to use it. However, there was one guy who was lucky. It was the sect master of Daotong's high-clarity pill cauldron sect, Gue Yuanzi. When he and old Lu were having a heart-to-heart talk on Mount June, there were 3 main culprits. One was Cheng Kangzi, the head disciple of the Nine Heavens Divine Thunder sect, who was torn to pieces by him in the wild forest. Ming Jinzi, who had taken away Lu Gongzan, was also killed by him in the Battle of Changji Town. There was also the sect master of the Pill Cauldron sect, Gue Yuanzi. After failing to kill Li Yunxin, this guy and Ming Jinzi went far away and never showed up again. But it was already marked in Li Yunxin's heart. He didn't know if he would be able to sleep peacefully during this period of time. The last time Li Yunxin heard of the name Gue Yuanzi was only recently. After Su Yusong imprisoned him in Mount Chuyun, he stayed in the profound sect's camp for a day, so he heard that this Gue Yuanzi was injured. Gue Yuanzi's lungs were injured when he fought with a great demon on the formation. This injury wasn't serious, but it wasn't light either. So Su Yusong told him to return to Cloud Mountain to recuperate. In reality, he wanted him to stay on Cloud Mountain to prevent any disasters. There were a total of 4 high-level cultivators who stayed on Cloud Mountain. 3 True Realm and 1 Profound Realm. Apart from Gue Yuanzi, the other 2 True Realm cultivators were seriously injured. It was said that they might not even be able to keep their corporeal bodies. The other Profound Realm cultivator, Li Yunxin, had never heard of him. But it was said that he was also seriously injured, so he didn't take it to heart at that time. But now it was such a coincidence. On the way to Cloud Mountain, he actually walked to the door of his enemy's house. Li Yunxin stood there and looked up the stairs for a while, then turned to look at Sanhua and asked heavily, "This is the Pill Cauldron sect's mountain gate. Are you familiar with it?" Sanhua's ears perked up. His long beard also perked forward. He seemed to be interested and excited. Familiar. Great King, you want to exterminate the entire sect? Exterminate the entire sect. This cat demon spoke in a soft voice, and as she spoke, she let out a maniacal laugh. But her words were talking about exterminating the entire sect, and the like. Those who didn't know what was going on would feel a chill run down their spine when they heard this. But Li Yunxin thought for a while, then shook his head. I'm not a devil. Gue Yuanzi is detestable, but those disciples under him have no enmity with me. If they don't cause trouble and are willing to stand at the side and watch me kill Gue Yuanzi, there's no need to exterminate his entire sect. The cat demon squinted her eyes and laughed. That's right. But not now. Li Yunxin took a step forward. Let's go to Cloud Mountain first. After the matter there is settled, I'll find this Gui Yuanzi and have a good talk. The cat demon blinked her eyes. Reluctantly, she looked towards the Pill Cauldron Sect's mountain gate for a while before following Li Yunxin's footsteps. After another hour, Li Yunxin knew that they had arrived. The two demons passed by many different landforms along the way, but they didn't see any other sect's mountain gate. Now they were in a snowy mountain canyon, surrounded by pure white snow. The stone walls on both sides that extended towards the sky were sealed by a layer of ice. There were no traces of life on the ground, only black rocks and snow. In front of them was the end, there was no more path. They faced a stone wall that was hundreds of meters tall, and they couldn't see the top. This was also the height of the canyon. Sanhua stopped in front of the stone wall, pressed her ears down, and used her front claws to dig the snow. After digging for a while, she shook off the snow that had fallen on her ears, then shook her head. "Ah, Great King Aya, we've arrived." Li Yunxin walked over and looked into the shallow hole that she had dug. He originally thought that it would be an entrance or something else, but in the end there was nothing but broken rocks. He frowned suspiciously. Sanhua squatted beside the hole, tilted her head, and used her front claws to dig the stones. Finally she pulled out a thumb-sized, ordinary-looking stone. She raised her head and looked at Li Yunxin. "We've arrived." Li Yunxin suddenly realized something. He stooped down and picked up the stone. Then he thought of Lord Dongting's Red Flower City. When that mysterious realm demon took Li Yunxin to Red Flower City for the first time, he found a very inconspicuous red flower on many flood dragon skeletons at the bottom of Dongting Lake. Inside the red flower was the vast dragon palace of Lord Dongting, a mysterious realm demon. Now, as soon as he held the stone in his hand, he immediately felt an indescribable emptiness. Although the stone was in his hand, the boundless space was unfolded in his mind. This sudden contrast made Li Yunxin's hand tremble slightly, and he almost dropped the stone on the ground. But only with the demon's permission could others enter Lord Dongting's Red Flower City. But the space inside the stone in his hand was open. It was not difficult to get in. The difficult part was to find it. Sanhua found it effortlessly, as if she was very familiar with everything on Cloud Mountain. She never explained anything, but she also never hid anything. Li Yunxin also wanted to find out about her, but he knew that now was not the time. He took a deep breath. Then, Sanhua raised her foot and scratched her ear. "Ah, Your Majesty, go. Haha, come back to the mountain. I'll kill them all." Li Yunxin knew that the mountain she said referred to the Pill Cauldron sect of the Shangqing sect. In fact, he could also see the greed in her eyes, like a cat that liked the smell of blood. But he didn't know what exactly this cat demon coveted in the Cloud Mountain of the Shangqing sect. Although he still had some doubts about this cat demon, he was not a timid person. He didn't have much time to begin with, and at this juncture, there was no need to hesitate. So he smiled. "Okay. Then wait for me here." After saying this, his consciousness suddenly sank. The howling of the snow and the bone-piercing chill in his ears immediately disappeared. He appeared in a familiar place, the stone path. When Xian Shilio brought him here on the Star Shuttle, for the first time, they also came out of the Star Shuttle through this stone path. At that time he thought that it was one of the countless paths leading to Little Cloud Mountain. But now he knew that it had always been this one path. He calmed his mind and walked at a moderate pace, sensing all the movements in this stone path. When he first entered Little Cloud Mountain, he walked to a certain place and suddenly saw a glimmer of hope. He walked into Little Cloud Mountain. Looking back, he could only see the stone wall but not the path he came from. This way of entering should be some kind of restriction or formation. Now Li Yunxin was faced with two possibilities. One was to walk in effortlessly just like the last time. The other was, after walking for half an hour, he realized one thing. This stone path had no end. He walked on the stone path at a moderate speed for almost an hour. But there was still endless darkness in front of him, and there was no change in his surroundings. He knew that if he continued walking he would walk until the end of time, until someone who knew how to break this restriction released him. So he stopped and let out a light breath. The next moment his consciousness moved, and his soul transformed into an avatar. He didn't know where this avatar would go. He just wanted to go as far as he could, hoping to appear in Little Cloud Mountain. But then with a grunt, he spat out a mouthful of golden dragon blood. The avatar was destroyed as soon as it appeared. He didn't know if it ran into this restriction. Like Tang Wakshu, not even a speck of dust was left, so this path wasn't the entrance either. This path seemed to be just a symbolic path, its direction didn't mean the direction of the entrance. But Li Yunxin just spat out the remaining blood in his mouth. Without any hesitation he created another avatar behind him. The next moment he spat out another mouthful of blood. The avatar was destroyed again. Any cultivator or demon who used their avatar as a pawn to explore the path couldn't afford it. If the avatar was damaged, their cultivation would also be greatly damaged. High-level cultivators and great fiendish demons often cultivated for hundreds or thousands of years. How long would it take to cultivate if one or two avatars were destroyed? But Li Yunxin didn't care. When he spat out the second mouthful of blood, he created a third avatar. So before the second mouthful of blood could be spat out, a third mouthful rose up his throat. Just like that, when the ground had been corroded by his 10th mouthful of blood and was riddled with holes, Li Yunxin was also sitting against the stone wall, barely breathing. Chapter 499. At this time, looking at his face, he no longer looked handsome. It was as if his vitality had been sucked away by a beautiful female ghost. Not only did his cheeks collapse, but his skin sagged and even dark brown spots climbed up to his forehead. He looked like an old man at the end of his life. There were countless people who sought death in the world. But those who sought death like Li Yunxin could be said to be unparalleled in the world. However, he found it. His 19th incarnation appeared in the little cloud mountain. The floating mountain where the two saints lived was in the middle of the vast space that was nearly 100 miles long and wide. Because of this distance, Li Yunxin's soul avatar not only appeared on Little Cloud Mountain, but also appeared on the floating mountain's group of palaces. Note 2. At this time his incarnation also faithfully reflected the appearance of the original body, a lamp at the end of its life, like an evil ghost, as if it would fall apart if it took a few more steps. The place where he appeared was a square paved with white jade. Looking around he could see the undulating mountains in the northwest. It was verdant and beautiful with overhanging eaves. He knew that it was the place where he was once imprisoned, the palace complex where the art saint once lived. He was imprisoned there for a long time, and while looking at the scenery every day he slowly figured out the layout of the floating mountain. Now he wanted to go there, because there was one of his treasures. Before Su Yusong took him out of Shaoyin Mountain, he had already broken the restriction in the study of the art saint and slipped out while those little people were attacking Su Yusong. But when he was about to reach the tree wall, he seemed to be exhausted and finally fell to the ground, and was easily captured by the fake saint. In fact, it was fake that he was exhausted, and the real reason was to deceive people. It was just to distract the fake saint. At that time, at the place where he fell, he buried a scale deep in the soil. His incarnation swept over there like a gust of wind while his original body sat outside on the verge of death. He carefully sensed the chi activity between his original body and his incarnation, in case he accidentally went overboard and his incarnation would disperse again. About a quarter of an hour had passed. The haggard Li Yunxin's original body let out a long breath. Then he slowly raised his hand, closed his eyes and chopped at his own head. Logically speaking, a palm strike from a perfected dragon great demon would be able to smash even metals and rocks into smithereens, let alone brains. But right now he was like a dried-up oil lamp, his arm was powerless. Unexpectedly this palm strike did not kill him, it only caused his forehead to cave in, causing one of his eyeballs to burst out. This time how painful it was. He had died neatly before. Even if they died outside the cloud mountains they did not suffer for long. But now his palm didn't kill him. Instead, it hurt so much that his limbs went soft. When he raised his second palm strike, it was even more powerless. His mind became even more chaotic, but he was still not dead. On the other hand, demons had strong vitality. The weaker he was, the harder it was to kill him. He dragged on like this for almost an hour as if he was torturing himself, until a large part of his head had sunk in, but he still had a breath of life left. This terrifying experience. In her heart, Li Yunxin cursed all the cultivators and demons in and out of Cloud Mountain, from her ancestors to the birds and beasts that she had nothing to do with. This dragged on for another quarter of an hour. Inside the Cloud Mountains, the soul that had been sitting powerlessly on the ground for a long time holding a piece of scale armor suddenly shook, turned into a demonic wind and attached itself to it. In the next moment, the transparent figure quickly took shape, colored, and became clear. Li Yunxin had once again taken over the body and returned to his original appearance. After his resurrection in the formation, his skin was delicate, and when he resurrected in the prison cell where Lu Gongzan was imprisoned, his skin was truly fragile. Now this was the third time. He was already extremely weak and every movement he made felt weak. After appearing, he pushed himself on the ground to stand up. Who knew that when he pushed himself up, his palm was poked by a grass stalk, immediately poking a hole. But this hole was like an illusion. As soon as it appeared, it healed immediately. But even so, Li Yunxin knew that it was not good. When he smashed the sword cultivator's head and sword with his palm, it was the metal pieces that cut his palm. But now he was cut by a grass stalk. The continuous possession and loss of his avatars had caused the demonic power in his body to be completely exhausted, and it also made his physical body look extremely fragile. It was even worse than a mortal with coarse skin and thick flesh. Although he had expected this and thought of a way to deal with it before he sought death for the third time. But now he still felt that the world suddenly became dangerous. He had been cultivating since he was young. Although his realm was not as high as it was now, he was still a young genius, and his physical body was far stronger than ordinary people. He did not care about any bumps and bumps. But now, it was the first time in his life that he experienced the feeling of his physical body being fragile. Although it did not affect his physique, it was still unpleasant. This kind of unhappiness appeared when he resurrected this time, and it was also because of the various tortures that his original body had suffered before. Li Yunxin stood up and cursed. He cursed as he walked. When he walked to the shallow bay in front of the art saint's study, he rolled his eyes. Then he bent down and put his mouth to the water, drinking like a whale. When he drank his stomach full of water, he let out a long sigh of relief. In fact, he was not thirsty. But he drank it for other purposes. Now he was in Mount Shaoyan. For a long time, this space had only been inhabited by 2 false saints. It was the enemy's hinterland lair, but it was also the safest place now. It was like a bank vault. He had gone through a lot of hardships to get here. How could he return empty-handed after entering a treasure mountain? So he narrowed his eyes, stretched out his hand to block the blazing sunlight from the dome and walked southeast. According to Xian Shilio, that was the dome hall. It was the place where Su Yusong and Zhuo Muzhe carried out their daily activities, and there were other things that the two of them regarded as treasures. Now he was going there. The Art Saints group of halls was on a small hill to the west of the floating mountain. He slowly walked down the road on the hill. There were exotic flowers and plants on the side of the road, their fragrance assailing his nostrils. Tall trees rustled in the wind, and there were bushes growing under the trees. Among the flowers and plants, there were occasionally fruits, but they were not ordinary flowers and fruits of the mortal world. In the past, Li Yunxin did not understand many cultivation classics, but he understood natural history. It must be known that Li Chunfeng and Shang Guanyu had conflicting thoughts. They wanted this child to stay away from disputes, but they could not bear to see him become a short-lived mortal. Thus, he had only taught him a few scattered spells, but had never been taught systematically. However, there were some things that he did not mind knowing. It was these natural history and miscellaneous knowledge. But a considerable part of these natural history and miscellaneous knowledge were dragon-slaying skills for the former Li Yunxin. He did not have a paradise, and naturally did not have the opportunity to see many rare treasures. But now there was a place for them to use. Finally, for the first time, he saw with his own eyes the appearance of many treasures whose names, habits, and effects he already knew. Therefore, he knew that the thumb-sized strings of bright red fruits here were called the 11 Silk Immortal Treasures. They contained extremely dense spiritual energy, but they were also highly poisonous. He could either plant them for fun, or use them to dilute the medicinal properties of pills. As Li Yunxin walked, he grabbed these bright red poisonous fruits in his hands, slapped them into his mouth, chewed until his mouth was full of red juice and swallowed them all. Ordinary fiendish demons might be afraid of the overbearing poisonous fruits. But dragons did not have bodies, they were all formed from dragon soul and demon power. No matter how poisonous they were, they could not poison Dragon's son. After eating these poisonous fruits, he saw a few tall and thin trees in front of him. They swayed in the warm wind, like a few thin and tall people lazily basking in the sun. This tree was called the Drunken Cloud Immortal Tree, and the fruit it bore was called the Drunken Cloud Fruit. Needless to say, the spiritual energy was also very dense, and it could be used to make bejeweled nectar wine, or eaten as a celestial quality fruit. But it was said that the Drunken Cloud Fruit had one drawback: it was the most sour in the world. To make celestial quality fruit to eat, it had to go through a complicated process of seasoning. Li Yunxin did not believe it. Seeing some light green chicken-sized fruits on the trees that were ripe, he plucked one and fiercely took a bite as he walked. As a result, he immediately grimaced and his saliva overflowed. This terrifying sourness caused his eyebrows to scrunch up. He threw the fruit away and then spat it all out. After spitting it out, he still felt sour, so sour that he was about to get angry, so he turned around and walked back. Previously, when he and Xian Shilio tested each other at the foot of the mountain, that demoness already had deep feelings for him. She told Li Yunxin many interesting things about Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia. For example, Su Yusong's favorite bejeweled nectar wine was made from the drunken cloud fruit. Moreover, only these 4 drunken cloud immortal trees here were the best. Every 10 years of wine brewing depended on them. Now that Li Yunxin thought of this, he walked in front of the 4 trees that were as thick as the mouth of a bowl. As far as he knew, such thick drunken cloud immortal trees should have been growing for thousands of years, and lifted his foot. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, all of them broke on the ground. Breaking them was not enough to vent his anger. Then he jumped up and trampled on the ripe and unripe fruits. As he trampled, he scolded, "You shameless bastard, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour?" After venting his anger here, he continued on his way. Then he saw things like corrosive grass, green lotus fruit, jade skin red sand seed, flying cloud apricot delicate, and so on and so forth. It must be known that many of the fruits that contained spiritual power were not meant to be eaten, so the taste was bound to be terrible. At this moment, the spiritual power in Li Yunxin's snow mountain and ocean of qi, or rather demonic power, was almost exhausted. Whatever could replenish spiritual power, he stuffed it into his mouth, regardless of what it was originally used for. However, not only did he eat it, but he also threw a tantrum. If he felt that the taste was not bad, he just passed by. If he felt that the taste was terrible, he would become fierce, scold, jump, beat and trample. How many of these poor immortal herbs, immortal trees and immortal flowers tasted good? Therefore everywhere he passed was a mess. How many precious treasures were ruined by him? If Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia really saw this, they would be so angry that they would vomit blood. When this devil finally walked down the gentle slope and turned ahead, he saw an even larger garden. ******. Note 1. The scale of Little Cloud Mountain is detailed in chapter 340. They are afraid. It is a space of nearly 100 miles in length and width, and the floating mountain is in the middle of the space. Note 2, there is a problem here. I thought of it, but everyone may not think of it. It is fine not to add notes, but I am afraid that careful readers will think it is not rigorous. The problem is that Li Yunxin is in the stone path, and he may not be close to the physical wall outside Little Cloud Mountain. In fact, he may be hundreds of miles away from the real Little Cloud Mountain. How can he be sure that his incarnation can appear in Little Cloud Mountain? The explanation for this problem is that the distance in the inhibition is not the actual distance. The reason why he knows this is that when he captured Snatch Fortune Quantum alive in Dongting Lake. At that time, Li Yunxin's incarnation was in Evil King's Pitfall Mountain, but his real body was in Dongting. The distance between the real body and the incarnation is far more than 30 miles, but the incarnation can still exist, because of the magic weapon Shenguang Mirror. Shenguang Mirror has the ability to cross space, so hundreds of miles in between are regarded as nothing. It is a bit abstract. But if the reader considers this problem, he should be able to understand. This sentence can be explained in the way of narration in the text. But too many such explanations will break the structure of the text. So I will not mention it in the text. Chapter 500. In order to know what this garden was for, one must first know what the palaces that once belonged to the art saint were for in the past. It was actually a livestock farm. Things like Xianmen treasures were like the painstaking work of mortal craftsmen. They couldn't be mass-produced, they were precious in quality. Thus, the materials used were all of the highest quality and couldn't be satisfied by the things in the mortal world. Many of the spiritual items used to craft treasures could only be found in Xianmen. And in Xianmen, the rarest of the rarest, could only be found on Little Cloud Mountain. In the past, there weren't any palaces in the northwest of the floating mountain, it was just a forest. There were many treasures and many treasures. But after Chen Hua established his sect and was recognized as the third saint, he came to Little Cloud Mountain and built his own residence in the only empty northwest area. Some of the less precious ones that were kept here, the ones that Li Yunxin destroyed as he walked, were left there and treated as a strange sight. And some of the truly precious ones that were crucial for Xianmen to craft treasures were kept in a garden. That was the garden that Li Yunxin saw at the bottom of the slope. The first thing he saw was a huge archway with 5 rooms and 6 pillars. It was an extremely gorgeous and exquisite thing, incomparably glorious and magnificent. Behind the archway was a wide path paved with spotless jade stones. On both sides were walls made of lush flowers and trees. Colorful butterflies danced in between. At the end of the path was a palace. Li Yunxin looked at the palace and frowned slightly. Although the palace was huge, it didn't seem to be big enough to contain many large beasts. On the battlefield he saw a huge golden horned hoe under Guqin Jun. It was one of the rare beasts in the world and its body was full of treasures. That golden horned giant centipede was almost the size of this palace, not to mention the others. But he knew that this was indeed a garden that hid many rare birds and beasts. Because he saw that on the horizontal board of this huge memorial arch, there were 3 big words written in a neat and orderly manner: Zoo. At this moment his craziness hadn't passed yet. For the past few months he had been struggling on the edge of life and death almost every day. It was already an unimaginable depression. Furthermore, in order to resurrect himself and enter this little cloud mountain, he had suffered a great deal of pain. That kind of pain could drive a normal person crazy, let alone him who wasn't a normal person to begin with. Therefore, now that he was suddenly out of danger, all the pent-up frustrations in his heart burst out. He had been able to endure more than an ordinary person before, but now he was even more crazy than an ordinary person. Now that he saw these 3 words, he suddenly felt excited. He casually threw away the half-eaten fruit in his hand and walked to the huge memorial arch. He stretched out a finger and tested it on the stone pillar. On his way down from the Art Saint's study, he had destroyed more than a few hundred natural treasures and eaten countless more. Regardless of whether those things tasted good or not, or whether they were poisonous or not, they all contained an astonishing amount of spiritual power. Although he was a perfected master and the amount of spiritual energy and demonic energy he needed was unimaginable, it was enough to build a foundation for his stomach. Now that he exerted his strength, his fingernails grew sharp. It was pale gold like a small knife. He left a mark on the stone pillar with a slash. He smiled, raised his hand and carved 7 big words in a flamboyant manner. Li Yunxin was here. Then he thought for a moment and walked a few steps away. On the other side of the pillar he carved another 8 small words. It's not right to write words everywhere. Then he laughed wildly, lifted the hem of his clothes, and strode along the path paved with white jade. He did not encounter any obstacles along the way. Because if he was Su Yusong or Zhuomuxia, there was no need to set up anything here. The entire space of the Cloud Mountain was filled with invisible restrictions. When cultivators and demons came here, they became ordinary people with strong bodies. But even with their powerful physical bodies, there was no way for them to leap thousands of meters from the ground and jump to this little Cloud Mountain. Such a natural obstacle almost eliminated all possibilities. Only the descendants of the painting Tao could sneak up from the path at the bottom of the mountain. However, the problem was that Li Yunxin, who had the highest cultivation of the painting Tao in the world and was the most troublesome, was already dead. Needless to say, it was difficult to enter Little Cloud Mountain, and even more difficult to enter Cloud Mountain. Moreover, they had also set up other methods here. However, Li Yunxin could not meet them now. He walked all the way to the front of the hall, up the 33 steps and into the front corridor. He raised his leg and kicked the door open. Then he saw an empty hall. It looked like it was sealed and not used. It was indeed built magnificently with tables and chairs, carpets, flowers and trees. However, no matter how he looked, it was just a main hall for receiving guests. It was not a zoo, or a place to raise rare birds and beasts. However, Li Yunxin was not in a hurry. Since he saw the words zoo on the signboard, he knew who had set up this place in the past. If there was really a garden behind the signboard, he would be surprised. So he chuckled a few times and jumped in, starting to search anxiously. Naturally, it was like a bandit entering the house. Wherever he saw could be hidden, he kicked it over. If he couldn't find it, he would be treated like the flowers and trees before, all of them would be trampled into pieces. Since he couldn't take it away, he wouldn't leave it behind. The decorations and vases in the hall were all rare treasures. Even gold, silver, and jade would be considered vulgar and dirty here. They were only worthy of being used to pave the floor like the outside. However, all of these things were picked up by Li Yunxin to look at. If he couldn't see it, he would fall to the ground and die a horrible death. So, he first destroyed the decorations in the hall, then flipped the tables and chairs. All the carpets were torn into pieces. In the end, only the paintings and sculptures on the wall were spared. So, he started to look at them one by one with his hands behind his back. They were all good stuff, but he had destroyed them all. So, until the 11th painting on the west side of the hall. Only then did Li Yunxin let out a ha. At first he thought it was a painting of words from afar. Of course it looked like words, it was framed and had a white background. There were some black characters on it. They seemed to be written in tadpole characters. But now that he looked closer he realized, it was clearly a painting. The painting was a banner. The title on the right had a few words written vertically. The words written at the front of the painting were called, Title. Remember to visit the zoo on a sunny morning. After this line of words was the painting. With one look, Li Yunxin knew that it must be Chen Zhao's work. There was an oval with 4 small sticks at the bottom. There was also a small stick at the top with a small circle on the stick. 2 more eyes, 2 ears, a triangular horn and a tail were added to the small round head. There were 4 words written on it: Golden Horn Giant Centipede. The other rare birds and beasts had similar techniques. The round body and stick legs were not very different. As if to distinguish them from each other, they were all marked. Flipping Feather, Flying Feather, Philian, Ingu, Riverside, Huodou, all kinds of ferocious beasts, strange beasts and auspicious beasts that Li Yunxin had heard of were all marked on the scroll. A rare beast was only the size of half a palm. This painting was more than 2 meters long. There were at least a few hundred of them lined up from the beginning to the end of the line. But even so, there was still a long line. So, there were many wavy patterns that went from thick to thin on the painting. It meant, there are many more in the distance but I can't see them clearly. They're all illusions. But this wasn't what Li Yunxin understood. It was indeed a note written in the gaps of the wavy patterns. After this comment there were even smaller, densely packed words that looked like smoke. They were all the names of rare birds and beasts. At a rough glance there were at least a few thousand. Actually, it looked like it. He had thought that he could draw on such a large piece of paper. But the more he drew the worse he felt. He could only use this method to make up for the number. Finally, there was a line of words at the end of the painting. It was a postscript. What a meaningful day. Li Yunxin stared at it for a while and frowned. Actually, this painting was slightly different from Chen Zhao's previous paintings. In her previous paintings, no matter how childish her strokes were, it was obvious that she had put her heart into them. For example, a child who had just learned how to draw would draw a chicken pecking rice. Even if it wasn't good, she wouldn't forget to point out the rice grains on the ground one by one. Some were serious and meticulous, but they didn't use dots. Instead, he was seriously drawing small circles one after another. But this painting. Looking at the row of beasts at the front, it was obvious that she was also serious. But after reaching it, she seemed to realize that there wasn't enough space, so she scribbled. Then she saw the wavy lines, which meant that she was too lazy to draw anymore. Instead, she was thinking of a way to finish it. This meant that Chen wasn't drawing this because she was interested. Instead, it was something that she had to finish. It was meant to be used. Thinking of this, Li Yunxin understood in her heart. He slowly put his hand on it and tried to feel the flow of spiritual power. Then he realized, it was exactly as he thought. This painting was similar to the other Octave Treasure scrolls. There was an astonishingly vast world inside. If he used enough spiritual power and found the right method, he could enter the painting. He had no doubt that every rare bird and beast whose name was written on the painting was in that world. There was indeed a zoo in the palace. It was this painting. But right now he didn't want to try. After all, his demonic power hadn't recovered yet. Plus, Chen was weird. He didn't know what tricks she had set up in the world in the painting that were interesting to her but dangerous to others. Finally, he didn't have any headaches. He didn't want to be stupid and put himself in danger again. But no matter what, he had to take this thing away. Many of the beasts in the painting should be grateful to Chen. If they weren't in the painting and Li Yunxin hadn't recovered his demonic power, he could take this thing for himself. He had planned to kill them all. The spiritual power in the immortal herbs and fruits was indeed dense. But no matter how dense those dead things were, they couldn't compare to these living things. If this really was a garden, and he had barged in, those that looked annoying would definitely be the first to be killed and eaten. Those that looked pleasant might also be eaten into his stomach happily, never to be separated. Those that didn't look annoying or pleasant. If that was the case, what was the point of living? Just kill and eat them too. But now they had escaped the calamity. Li Yunxin reached out and took the painting off the wall, rolling it into a scroll. He tore a piece of cloth from somewhere and tied it to his back. Then he went straight to the Dome Hall. Xan Shilio had said that many of Su Yusong and Zhuomuji's treasures were in that hall. The Dome Hall wasn't far from here. On the way he passed by a few small halls, but Li Yunxin didn't pay attention to them. He only moved up and down on the top of the hall like a martial arts expert in the mortal world. He was extremely happy. After a little more than a minute, he saw the square in front of the Dome Hall. However, this place was no longer as empty as the other places. There was a guard on the square. This meant that Xan Shilio was right. There was indeed something extremely precious to the two fake saints here. As a result, they called the reincarnation of the former master of calligraphy to guard it. On the incomparably wide square was Su Sheng. Li Yunxin stood on the top of the hall nearly 100 steps away from him and saw him standing alone in the square. The ground of the square was white, and Su Sheng's clothes were blue. He wore tight clothes and short clothes. He stood as straight as a javelin, and there was no expression on his face. His eyes were wide open and his eyeballs kept looking left and right, observing the surrounding situation. This scene looked strange and terrifying. Li Yunxin knew at a glance that this reincarnation was now being controlled by Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia. Previously, at the foot of the mountain, when Su Sheng was still hiding in his sleeve, he had mentioned this matter. For example, he knew that the first step to refining a person into a wandering soul was to completely destroy their clear consciousness. Then the person's head would be empty and he would become a puppet. He would do whatever his master said. But after all, it was only his clear consciousness being erased, and his brain wasn't damaged. Therefore, not only was this puppet obedient, but it could also adapt to the situation. It was much more brilliant than the ordinary strong men and gods created by magic. If this puppet was refined with a secret method and injected with spiritual intelligence, it could become a wandering soul. However, in that way it wouldn't be as useful as the previous stage of the puppet. The fake saint wanted to refine this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher into a wandering soul. But the battle at the foot of the mountain took a turn for the worse, and he only had time to completely erase his consciousness. Now he asked this puppet to guard in front of the hall just in case. Finally he could guard against Li Yunxin's what if. This reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had a strong physical body. Although he didn't have supernatural powers, he could use the supernatural powers of others. He might not be able to fully use them here, but there were many restrictions on Shaoyin Mountain that were still slightly effective. If this reincarnation of the calligrapher used those restrictions and formations, with Li Yunxin's current cultivation, if they really fought, it would be a tough battle where both sides would suffer and even a crushing defeat. Therefore he thought about it and sat down on the roof of another hall in front of the square. He narrowed his eyes and observed Su Sheng from afar with a pensive look on his face. Chapter 501. At this time, it was afternoon on Little Cloud Mountain. The sun was bright and the temperature was pleasant. The leaves rustled in the warm wind, which was filled with the fragrance of flowers, and there was the clear chirping of birds. Apart from that, the surroundings were very quiet, which reminded Li Yunxin of the previous world. It was also in the afternoon of a scorching summer. There was no one on the street, only the rustling of the leaves of an old tree on the street. The old dog was lying in the shade of the old tree, and the old man was sleeping on a rattan chair. It was as if the whole world had calmed down. He sat on the yellow glazed roof, and the tiles around him were warm from the sun. Su Sheng stood alone in the bright white square, like a lonely tree. Li Yunxin stared at him for a while, and realized that this guy was now guarding a certain area. If he didn't enter that area, the puppet would be fine. So he stretched out his hand and broke off a corner of the tile. Then he narrowed his eyes, glanced at it and threw it over. There was a great distance between the two. But the physical strength of cultivators and demons also meant that their reaction and control abilities were extremely strong. Thus, this palm-sized corner smashed into Su Sheng's head, producing a distant, muffled thud. The tile shattered, and a white mark was left on Su Sheng's forehead. So he suddenly came alive. He suddenly raised his eyes and looked in Li Yunxin's direction, his face filled with violence and confusion. He seemed to have no idea why he was beaten. He looked like a ferocious beast at this time. But he only came alive for a moment. The next moment he slowly lowered his head and stood like a tree again. Li Yunxin thought for a while, then raised his voice and said, "Hey little brother. Come out to play?" Su Sheng heard his words. He raised his head slightly again. He looked at the direction of the voice for a while, then slowly lowered his head. So Li Yunxin let out a light breath and smiled again, "Then I'll go in and play with you." After saying this he jumped down from the roof. Since he had no magical power, he couldn't float. His entire body landed on the ground with a thump. The white jade under his feet immediately cracked open like a spider's web. The cracks spread densely in all directions, causing a wave of dust to ripple. Thus, at this moment, Su Sheng suddenly raised his head and puffed out his chest like a puppet. The joints of his four limbs let out a series of violent cracking sounds, and even a white mist rose from his body. Then, the puppet created by the saint's tribulation body suddenly frowned and shouted, "What kind of monster are you? How dare you barge into the dome hall?" This terrifying puppet seemed to still be able to use the remaining restrictions on Little Cloud Mountain. As he shouted, ripples appeared in the air in front of him. It was obvious that this was not the power of his physical body. As soon as he finished speaking, the ground beneath his feet cracked and caved in. In the next moment, he leaped over 60 feet with a single step, and his entire body was wrapped in blazing lightning as he pounced towards where Li Yunxin was standing. In the face of such terrifying momentum and power, Li Yunxin did not retreat even half a step. The distance between the two of them was only 60 feet, and Su Sheng could reach him in 3 steps. However, when Su Sheng took the first step, he restrained his expression and said in a deep voice, "King." Su Sheng heard this voice, but he turned a deaf ear to it. When his second step landed on the ground, there was an even more terrifying shattering sound, dust, and the sound of the wind. Even when he could already feel the strong wind blowing against his face, Li Yunxin still did not retreat half a step. He stared calmly and coldly at Su Sheng, who was approaching him like lightning, and said 2 more words, "Sea Lion." The puppet leaped up a second time and landed a second time, finally arriving in front of Li Yunxin. The terrifying lightning on his body instantly ignited a few strands of long hair hanging in front of Li Yunxin's forehead. He used his fingers as a knife, and a brilliant golden light appeared on his fingertips. It was like a light all that pierced straight towards Li Yunxin's face. At this moment, Li Yunxin said the last 2 words, "Scepter." Then he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. There was a crisp sound, pop. The ruthless puppet suddenly widened its eyes and saw Li Yunxin's appearance in front of it. In the next moment, the lightning around its body suddenly retracted, and the golden light on its fingertips also dissipated. It shouted loudly, "Get out of the way!" Its right foot stomped on the ground and it changed its direction in midair. Its palm blasted the ground beside Li Yunxin. Then there was a terrifying rumbling sound. The floor tiles on the white jade-paved ground surged up like turbulent waves, shooting straight into the sky. The huge force did not decrease. It first blasted the floor tiles behind Li Yunxin, and then it continued forward, straight to the front hall where Li Yunxin had been standing before. The tall and majestic front hall was like a piece of paper in front of this force. It only took a moment for it to collapse. Countless pieces of earth and stone tore through the air like a storm and shot forward with a buzzing sound. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, the power of a single strike had destroyed 3 great halls in succession. Behind Li Yunxin, a terrifyingly wide and terrifyingly long stretch of ruins was blasted out. And this was the result of Su Sheng forcefully dispersing his supernatural power and holding back his strength at the last moment. Now he was lying on the ground in a slightly embarrassed state and his hair was in a mess. But he was no longer in a daze. Before the huge roar dissipated, he suddenly jumped up from the ground and shouted at Li Yunxin, "Why didn't you dodge? If this palm hit you, your body and soul would have been destroyed." Li Yunxin laughed. Then he raised his hand to extinguish the fire that had just ignited in his hair, because it was exciting. Then he lifted his foot and walked into the dome hall. Su Sheng gritted his teeth. Exciting? But after saying this word he didn't know what else to say. Slightly stunned, he hurriedly followed Li Yunxin's footsteps, looking like he had a lot to say. "What kind of curse did you just say?" After saying this, he immediately said, "You threw a tile at me? You even made fun of me at that time." Li Yunxin snorted as he walked. "Curse? Even if it's a curse, I reconstructed 11 personalities for you before, there must be a few awakening commands. It's the curse you mentioned. But how the 2 wandering souls erased the consciousness of a person and what state it would be after erasing is all what you said to me before. Your face just now was scarier than a dead person's. I had to test whether your original consciousness was still there or not. Once something went wrong with what you said to me, I jumped in and couldn't wake up the next layer of your consciousness. Then it's not a problem of excitement anymore. So I smashed you first, teased you and observed." He said these words in one breath. In fact, he walked fast but spoke slowly. When he said this, he reached the door of the dome hall. Again he raised his foot and kicked the door down. Then he stood in front of the door and looked inside. The hall was huge, almost like a stadium in his time. There was not a single pillar in the terrifyingly vast space. The ground was black, and the ceiling was filled with countless bright lights, like a bright starry sky. On the other side of the door was an entire wall. There was nothing else on the wall, just a dense number of cabinets, from the east to the west of the hall, from the ground to the dome. Perhaps this was the origin of the name Dome Hall. After looking for a while, Li Yunxin suddenly laughed coldly, and his laughter made people's hair stand on end. "Oh, this is the place where the 2 bastards hid and schemed against people." But Su Sheng only asked the person beside him, 11? What 11? Didn't you tell me there were only 8? Li Yunxin didn't turn his head and seemed to be perfunctory. just to be safe. Then he stepped into the door and walked to the wall of cabinets that occupied an entire wall. Su Sheng, on the other hand, was asking about his personality. When he first saw Li Yunxin, he was decadent like a useless person. So, Li Yunxin reconstructed a consciousness for him, but soon that consciousness fell again. So, Li Yunxin reconstructed a third consciousness for him. When Li Yunxin arrived at the foot of the floating mountain and stayed for a few days with Xan Shilio, Su Sheng told him a plan. He knew that once the two wandering souls caught him, they would not kill him but refine him. When Su Sheng was still the master of calligraphy, his body was taken away. Before escaping from Cloud Mountain by chance, he once learned how they refined wandering souls. The first step was to destroy the person's consciousness. At that time, he felt that it would be extremely difficult for this body to survive. Instead of that, it was better to give up this body and boldly test it, to ask Li Yunxin to build a few more layers of consciousness for him. Then he pretended to be captured and asked the two wandering souls to destroy his consciousness. If what Li Yunxin built didn't work, then it wouldn't hurt to give this crippled body to the Freemasonry. If it had worked, it would have led to the current situation where they were working together from the inside and outside. Thus, in the previous situation, the wandering souls had indeed destroyed Su Sheng's consciousness. However, the so-called consciousness was only the surface of the 11 layers of consciousness that Li Yunxin built for him. If this layer was destroyed, there was still the 10th layer. If the 10th layer was destroyed, there was still the 9th layer. This method did not belong to any kind of magical power in this world. It specialized in the level of consciousness. Even in Li Yunxin's previous world, it was an unimaginable and unbelievable method. How could he guard against the two wandering souls? So, as long as Li Yunxin gave him a few awakening instructions in advance, Su Sheng's 10th layer of consciousness immediately restarted and regained his consciousness. But at that time, Su Sheng felt that this body had no hope of surviving the tribulation. Who would have thought that after that, because of Li Yunxin's words in Qinzhao's study, the last tribulation was completed and he was about to transform and leave. Luckily, Su Yusong stopped him, so the plan didn't fail. Now, Su Sheng was complaining that Li Yunxin had done something to his mind behind his back and built a few more layers of consciousness. But complaining was just complaining, he didn't take it to heart. Because this body's tribulation was complete, he could transform and leave at any time. Because of this, Su Sheng still had the mind to linger here and not leave. He kept following behind Li Yunxin, planning to see why he came to the Dome Hall. Because, what are you doing here? After complaining for a while, he tidied up his messy hair and said behind Li Yunxin, "There's only human skin here. There's nothing you want." The two wandering souls had taken over the bodies of the two saints. For the first many years, he wore the skin of a saint and wore it happily. But as time went on, they got tired of it. Luckily, the two wandering souls lived on Little Cloud Mountain. No one usually came. They didn't have their own missions and missions like the other wandering souls. They had to faithfully play their roles at all times. Thus, he was in a leisurely mood to change into some other clothes. Other people's clothes were fabric or leather. Their clothes, however, were the skin of a human. For example, when two people slept together at night, they didn't want old skin. It was wrinkled and shriveled and didn't feel good. They needed skin and flesh that was tender, well-proportioned, and youthful and beautiful. It was only comfortable to hug, touch, and kiss. But after choosing handsome men and beautiful women up Little Cloud Mountain, killing them, skinning them, and wearing them all, they felt that they were too beautiful and tired of looking at them. So they wanted to look ignorant and young. So they chose 15 or 16 years old and had delicate features to wear. And so on. They liked to wear the appearance of a Taotai when eating. They liked to wear the appearance of a tyrant when giving advice. They liked to wear the feather fan and silk scarf when drinking tea. How many years had the two wandering souls been trapped in Little Cloud Mountain, and how many emotions and ways had they played with each other? In the end, the fruits of evil fell on the mortals of Little Cloud Mountain. When those poor mortals were chosen, they only said that it was a great blessing and that they were going to serve the two saints and obtain immortality. After 1,000 years, the north wall of this huge palace was filled with cabinets. Those cabinets were innumerable at once. They were densely arranged on the wall as if there were as many stars in the sky. Inside each compartment was a skin which used to be a living life. When Su Sheng asked Li Yunxin what he was doing here, Li Yunxin had already walked to the bed. This bed was the place where the two fake saints usually changed clothes and chatted. It was unusually spacious, simple, and comfortable. Li Yunxin stood in front of the bed and was silent for a while. Then he sneered, "Nothing I want? The treasure I want the most is here. Let me ask you first, You said that your body is also on the floating mountain, is it here? Su Sheng was startled. Not here. It's somewhere else. What treasure? Li Yunxin chuckled. It's the treasure I want. 3 words, I'm happy. As he said this, he lifted the hem of his shirt and untied his belt. Su Sheng was startled at first, then he widened his eyes, thinking that he had seen wrongly. Huh? What are you doing? Li Yunxin reached out and pushed him behind him. Su Sheng heard the sound of water. The reincarnation of the former saint was stunned. No matter how crazy he was, he would never have thought that Li Yunxin was doing this. Li Yunxin was doing something that was extremely strange to the cultivators above the transcendent state, especially to him, and he had even forgotten the existence of this kind of behavior. He was peeing on the bed that the 2 fake saints usually sat on. Su Sheng was dumbfounded. Li Yunxin was not embarrassed at all. After he was resurrected in the courtyard of the art saint's study, he immediately went to the bay and drank a bellyful of water, not because he was thirsty but because he wanted to do this. He soaked the bed evenly as if there was no one else around. Then he tied the belt again, turned around and looked at Su Sheng, who was stunned, and said expressionlessly, "What is this called?" "It's called moving clouds and bringing rain. If the 2 bastards come back alive, I'll let them enjoy the grace of the Dragon King." Then he leaped over the bed and stood in front of the towering wall of cabinets. He looked up and took a deep breath. He turned his wrist and untied the memories of a sunny morning visit to the zoo painting that he was carrying on his back. He slowly unrolled the painting, squinted his eyes, and found a name in the words that looked like a black cloud. Then he channeled his chi and used 2 fingers to reach into the painting and pulled. An earth-shattering cry of a baby reverberated in the spacious hall. What he pulled out of the painting was none other than a baby roe deer. This strange beast had a chubby baby face, but its body was that of a small roe deer. It was also a ferocious beast. He loved to harm people, but for no other reason than to eat people's skins. It often hid in the mountains in the middle of the night when it was quiet. When someone passed by, it would cry like a baby. Once a kind-hearted person heard the cry, it would immediately bite the person to death, and then slowly gnaw off the skin, leaving only a bloody body. Now that it was pulled out of the painting by Li Yunxin, it opened its mouth and was about to bite him. Li Yunxin immediately raised his hand and gave it 2 slaps. Only then did the ferocious beast realize its power. It did not bite him, but stared at the towering wall of cabinets with its eyes wide open. He laughed coldly and said, "Go eat." After saying that, he threw the roe deer baby against the wall. The ferocious beast immediately disappeared into the wall, and only a series of growling sounds could be heard from the bottom to the top. It passed through the wall unimpeded and began to eat heartily. Chapter 502. Su Sheng was even more puzzled when he saw what he did. He wanted to walk to Li Yunxin's side. But when he took a step forward, he thought of what Li Yunxin had done on the bed, so he quickly stepped back and frowned. "What are you doing?" Li Yunxin laughed strangely. "What am I doing? I'm happy to make those 2 bastards unhappy." He laughed while listening to the sound of the roe deer eating human skin, as if he was enjoying some heavenly music. Su Sheng sighed and shook his head. "Alas. You're being childish. These things are, after all, worldly possessions. To them." Li Yunxin laughed coldly and interrupted his words. She looked at him from the corner of her eyes. "Worldly possessions? Humph, you cultivators practice evil techniques and don't look like humans, so of course you don't think it's a big deal. But those 2 wandering souls are much more like humans than you." After saying this, he walked back and forth in front of the cabinet proudly. If he had a tail, it would probably be sticking up. They have their own obsession, so their 7 emotions and 6 desires are very heavy. Human skin can be easily peeled off, so it's not a big deal. But these 2 bastards have been collecting these things for 1,000 years, and they're not tired of it. Instead, they put them in this hall. "Tell me, are these things worldly possessions to them?" He said while gritting his teeth. "I said a few bad things about them in front of Xanxilio, so those 2 bastards held a grudge against me. They wanted to keep me alive, but in the end they wanted to kill me." Hold a grudge. Is there anyone in the world who holds a grudge better than me? Destroying their skin today is just an appetizer. In the future, if they are lucky enough to survive this time, it will be the beginning of the show. Bastards. Kill me. How painful it feels to beat your own eyeballs out. He sneered while pacing back and forth, muttering and gnashing his teeth as he said these words. This made Su Sheng's heart tremble. He looked at Li Yunxin. No matter how he looked at her, she looked like a lunatic, but she was still conscious. It was really strange. But after hearing his words, she couldn't help but say, Didn't you plan to kill you from the start? Didn't you say that if those two wanted to keep you alive, they would find a way to make them hate you so much that they would kill you in front of the formation so that they could escape? Li Yunxin stopped and turned around to glare at him. He said confidently, so what if I am? I asked him to kill them and he actually killed them. What's wrong with me bearing a grudge against him? Su Xing let out another sigh. Crazy. This Li Yunxin was probably really crazy. Perhaps his spirit had been damaged by the possession over and over again. But he wasn't sure. He had only heard Li Yunxin mention this method, but he didn't know the inside story. But no matter what, Su Xing shook his head. Fine. In the end, I won't be able to stay here for long, so I'm leaving just like that. If you want to go crazy and wreak havoc on Cloud Mountain, I'll accompany you. After saying this, he said sternly, but you did this to vent your anger. But didn't your previous efforts go to waste? You originally planned to let everyone think that you were dead. Now that you sneaked back and saved someone, you still have a way to cover it up. But to make such a ruckus, those two wandering souls will know that it was your doing. Li Yunxin turned around and looked at him disappointedly. Friend, are you stupid? If you ran to someone's house and melted their talisman, would you leave a note saying that it was done by me? When Su Xing interacted with Li Yunxin previously, he felt that although he was strange and crazy, he was still polite and restrained. But now that Li Yunxin was released from the layers of pressure, he immediately changed. When he talked to him again, even if it was the sage's reincarnation, he was like a gangster in the market, no respect at all. But Su Xing didn't want to argue with this madman. Although he didn't know if the talisman Li Yun mentioned was a Daotong talisman or a Kenzo talisman, he still sighed. Of course I don't. Li Yunxin suddenly laughed. I do. After saying this, he casually pulled down a cabinet door. The cabinet was empty. The skin had been eaten by the roe deer baby. Then he stretched out his finger and carved a few words on the cupboard that was taller than a person. Li Yunxin destroyed the bastard's human skin here. After thinking for a while, he carved a small line next to the words, look at the back, there's a surprise. As he carved, he couldn't help but laugh. This made Su Sheng's heart pound. He was a demon after all, a demon. Then he saw Li Yunxin flip the door over and carve, I told you to look, so look. Stupid. After carving this, he couldn't help but laugh. Su Xing sighed again. Just as he was about to tell him that it was useless, he suddenly realized Li Yunxin's carvings were a bit strange. As soon as he thought of this, he immediately let out a soft, "Ha." After taking a closer look, he cried out, You're imitating Qin Zhao's handwriting. Qin Zhao's drawing skills were bad, but his handwriting was passable. After all, he had lived for a long time. With some practice, he wouldn't be too bad. And Li Yunxin's talent didn't need to be mentioned. After all, he had seen many of Art St. Qin Zhao's handwriting. After seeing it and thinking about it, he could imitate it pretty well. At this time, whether it was the handwriting left on the zoo arch or the one left on the cabinet door, it wasn't his but Qin Zhao's. And the tone of those words was very similar to Qin Zhao's. When Su Xing said this, Li Yunxin suddenly stopped laughing. He stopped smiling and turned to look at Su Xing. His tone became serious. But this isn't enough. So, I have another thing to ask you. As he spoke, he flattened the cabinet door with one hand and put the other hand on it. He stared at Su Xing. What does Qin Zhao look like? Su Xing was stunned. Then he realized what Li Yunxin was going to do. He hesitated for a moment and said, Okay. However, this method of yours might not necessarily work. Qining actually looks a bit flirtatious. Ordinary women would always have a flirtatious appearance and would always give off a frivolous and unrestrained feeling. But Qin Zhao, this person makes me feel that he's really smart. Li Yunxin interrupted him. Tell me the details. For example, what kind of eyes, what shape do they look like, whether the corners of the eyes are raised or lowered, whether there are any sleeping silkworms. Also, whether the nose is straight or narrow, whether there are spots or moles on the face. Don't get emotional when you talk about these. Su Xing blinked his eyes. You want to draw her image? That might not be able to fool the two wandering souls. You have to know that they. Li Yunxin spread his hands and tilted his head at him. Su Xing said, Okay. I'll do as you say, Qin Zhao's eyes. After all, he had been with Qin Zhao for 1,000 years. Naturally, they didn't see each other every day. Sometimes they would see each other 2 or 3 times a day, or sometimes only once in a few years. But he still remembered their faces. Now, he was able to describe them in detail. As he spoke, he saw Li Yunxin use his sharp nails to gently scratch on the cabinet door. The technique wasn't the one commonly used in painting or in the current world. The lines were fine and messy as if he was randomly smearing. But he was knowledgeable and slowly realized that Li Yunxin was trying to use this method to restore Qin Zhao's original appearance. Only a few people in Li Yunxin's previous world used this method. These people were called criminal sketchers. Before the technology was developed, they would listen to the victim's description of the suspect's appearance and draw a portrait that was strikingly similar to the victim. Li Yunxin had never done this before. But because of his previous profession, he had come into contact with many such people. People who worked in this profession needed his professional help slightly more often than others. But he wondered if they would be scared if they knew that the person they asked for help looked like this. But no matter what, he would also practice painting in this life. Art skills were often interconnected. Now that he had a solid foundation, he got good results on the first try. At first he was far from it. Li Yunxin didn't draw as well as he wanted. But after about 15 minutes, as Su Sheng described more and more details, Li Yunxin's character looked more and more like it. Su Sheng's eyes slowly lit up. He didn't know how many more interesting things Li Yunxin was hiding. Although it was hard to deal with when he went crazy, there were many times when he could surprise people. Just like that, almost an hour passed. So, a woman's appearance was engraved on the back of the cabinet door. Li Yunxin exhaled softly and tilted his head to examine it. Then he proudly showed it to Su Sheng. "How is it? Does it look like this?" When he spoke, his joy was overflowing. It was unknown if he was happy because he had done something he had never done before, or because he finally knew what Qining looked like. Su Sheng looked at it too. But he frowned and shook his head. "That's not right." Li Yunxin stared. "Huh. You clearly described it like this. Similar in appearance. But not in spirit." Su Sheng sighed. "The eyebrows and eyes are all right. But it lacks her lively temperament. You should know that temperament is very difficult to grasp. This time your craftsmanship was too strong. You pursued the resemblance too much, so the artistic conception is lacking. In my opinion, this is a small trick. Should be crazy." Li Yunxin ignored him and closed the cabinet door. He raised his hand and tapped a few spots on the back of Qin Ying's figure, drawing a few runes. Then he suddenly waved his hand and erased the image. For example, when he was in Qinghe County, he had drawn the 9th young master and summoned his virtual image. It was because he had carefully observed him and felt the flow of energy around him. Thus, the painting had some of the 9th young master's spiritual qi. So, once he used it, the 9th young master's spiritual qi made the virtual image even more vivid. It was exactly the same as the 9th young master himself. As for the other masters in the world, the clay statues and portraits worshipped in the temples were painted with the spiritual qi of the true God. It was more or less the same. But he had never seen Qining himself. So he used another method. First, he drew Qin Ying's appearance. Then he drew it purely as if it was a person he had created out of thin air, just like how he drew some strong men or gods. It looked dazzling, but it was all for show. It was just to scare people. This was the so-called illusion technique and smokescreen. He had left a few runes on the portrait to ensure that it could be projected. When he was done, he inserted the cabinet door into the ground. The cabinet used to store the treasures of the 2 wandering souls was naturally not ordinary. The cabinet door was like tofu under Li Yunxin's fingers. It was inserted into the black jade floor, but the black jade was like tofu. Just like that, he stood facing the door of the hall. Li Yunxin took a few steps back and pointed at the back of the cabinet door. Immediately there was a flash of green light. A figure appeared out of thin air. It was Qin Ying's appearance. Seeing this, Su Sheng was a bit dazed. Previously, he had not felt anything when he saw the carvings on the cabinet door. Now that he saw the image, he realized that Li Yunxin was really amazing. Even he could not tell the difference between Li Yunxin and Qining. Li Yunxin stared at the figure silently for a while. Suddenly he laughed strangely. Then he stretched out his hand and pointed forward. In a soft voice he said, "You're dead." This voice made Su Sheng's body go numb. It sounded like he was shouting with his throat pinched. When he heard Qin Ying's shadow repeat it, he realized that Li Yunxin was teaching this thing to speak. But the voice was naturally different from Qin Ying's. So, they asked and answered again, slowly polishing the voice into Qin Ying's appearance. When everything was done, Li Yunxin turned around and unrolled the scroll. He drew something on the paper casually. The roe deer baby that had finished eating the human skin but was still hiding in the cabinet turned into a beam of green light and was sucked back. Then, Li Yunxin said calmly, "Where are the other treasures of Cloud Mountain, Daotong and Kenzo?" Hearing this, Su Sheng was moved. "What do you mean?" Li Yunxin smiled. "What do I mean? You don't think that I've endured for so long, used so many schemes and suffered so much, just to step on some flowers and plants, kidnap some rare animals and destroy some clothes? He sneered again. The other treasures of Cloud Mountain, the treasures left by the saints of Daotong and Kenzo as well as many pills, where are they? I've died a few times now and my demonic power is almost gone. Do you think I'm going to rely on myself to slowly cultivate, enjoy incense and spend hundreds or thousands of years to find them? Of course I still need to take pills. Su Sheng frowned and stared at him. Take pills? Do you know how many miraculous pills there are on Cloud Mountain? How are you going to take them? They all have different effects and uses. Although they all have spiritual power, if you eat them as pills to replenish spiritual power, it's like using the beautiful clothes of the mortal world to add fuel to the fire and boil water. It's like burning a zither and boiling a crane. How many do you need to eat to replenish your demonic power? As he said this, his expression became serious. If you want to take revenge on the two wandering souls, I won't say a word. But if you want to destroy the foundation of Cloud Mountain, I won't allow it. Chapter 503. From the moment Li Yunxin met Su Sheng to the moment he spoke, this was the most serious this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had ever been. His expression changed almost instantly. His tone was firm and it seemed that there was no room for negotiation. So Li Yunxin squinted his eyes. His eyes used to be black and white. Now that he was squinting, his pupils instantly turned into a brilliant gold, with a thin black line in the middle. Coupled with his previous crazed look and the spacious and quiet atmosphere in the hall, people couldn't help but feel their hair stand on end. It was as if Li Yunxin had suddenly turned into a terrifying beast at this moment, about to devour people. The real master of calligrapher would not feel anything when he looked like this. But now this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had a lot of emotions, and because of those emotions he was slightly shocked by his look. But then he sneered, Li Yunxin, what? Do you want to turn against me? I know you are originally eccentric, but I always think this is also your outstanding point. I also know that your mind will be affected by these big changes, so I let you do many things. Su Sheng stared at him seriously. At the same time he took 2 steps back. He was not showing weakness. He was seriously keeping a distance from Li Yunxin and preparing for something in case Li Yunxin suddenly attacked him. The current Li Yunxin was not the Li Yunxin outside the Cloud Mountain. Without any scruples, without any pressure, he had already revealed his true self. In the past he was wearing a human skin. No matter his appearance, character, or thinking, he was wearing a human skin. But now he seemed to have temporarily thrown away the skin. Su Sheng could not tell what kind of existence Li Yunxin was at this moment. He was like a human but not a human, like a demon but not a demon. He was not even sure how to deal with him. If he was really a demon, he would naturally get rid of this demon as the reincarnation of the master of calligrapher. But he was not. He still had a lot of human energy. But to say that he was a human being, who could predict what he would do or say in the next moment. Su Sheng frowned and continued, but this matter is related to the fate of the world. The treasures on Little Cloud Mountain, what kind of treasures do you think they are in the treasury of a mortal emperor? Those so-called treasures were nothing more than playthings to look at. But which one of the treasures inside wasn't powerful enough to stir up a storm of blood the moment they appeared? It was fine to just talk about the functions of these magic treasures. But what do these treasures actually amount to? It's almost half of the foundation of the Celestial Gate. It was half of the foundation of the world's righteous path. Daotong and Kenzoish treasures. That's easy for you to say. But actually it's the most, at this point he paused twice. Because he really didn't know what to say. It was also because he had never had the chance to talk about such a thing before, to explain to a person the weight of the treasures left behind by the saints of Daotong and Kenzo over the past 50,000 years. Who dared, to ask such a thing? Su Sheng simply couldn't believe that Li Yunxin dared to have designs on these things. He also couldn't believe that he actually wanted to explain to him, persuade him, and discuss with him to convince him. His words could be said to be sincere and well-intentioned. Who in the world had the face to be treated like this by the reincarnated body of a saint? But what about that Li Yunxin? He wasn't satisfied and didn't appreciate it. He actually laughed coldly and interrupted Su Sheng. Oh. In the end you just don't want to help me. After saying this he put away the scroll in his hand, tied it to his back and strode out of the hall. If you don't want to help me, I'll look for it myself room by room. I'll destroy them all and see if I can find it. Su Sheng's face turned cold. You dare? Others fell for his trick, but Li Yunxin didn't fall for it. He laughed coldly 3 times and shot out like lightning, "You see if I dare or not?" Even though his monster power hadn't recovered, his strong body was still there. In just 2 breaths' time he jumped out of the door, like an eagle rising from the ground, flipping over to the roof of the hall. Then he stomped on the roof, and like an arrow leaving the bow, he shot towards a 6-story exquisite pagoda in the northwest direction. There was only a waterside pavilion between this pagoda and the dome hall. The waterside pavilion floated on a round lake with shimmering water and green lotuses. It was a rare and beautiful scene. Li Yunxin descended from the sky and landed on the eaves of the waterside pavilion, stomping on it. The eaves immediately rumbled and a big hole appeared. He used the force of this stomp to jump up again, but he said, "This is also the place where those 2 bastards go sightseeing. Let's see if there are any treasures hidden here." After saying this, he struck down with his palm in mid-air. Monster power gushed out. With a deafening sound, a perfectly good waterside pavilion exploded. The broken bricks and tiles flew in all directions, shooting far away. The surrounding green lotuses were smashed into smithereens. The originally clear water was also smashed by the falling wooden beams and rocks, turning muddy. The pitiful waterside pavilion was actually just a big octagonal pavilion with double eaves and a long corridor. There were no walls around, not even a curtain. What could be hidden? Su Xing knew that this Li Yunxin wasn't looking for treasures. He was obviously destroying everything he saw to vent his anger. He didn't know why he suddenly became so angry. Even though his tribulation body didn't have any divine powers, he could use divine powers. Seeing Li Yunxin's crazy look, he knew that he couldn't be arrogant anymore. Thus he shouted in a low voice, "You're too naughty." As soon as he finished speaking, he leaped up just like Li Yunxin and chased after him in the direction he had gone. In just a few leaps he was very close to Li Yunxin. He shouted again, "Li Yunxin, the restrictive spell on the mountain is still there. Do you really want me to use those methods to deal with you?" What he got was nothing else, but Li Yunxin had already leaped up to the top of the 6-story exquisite pagoda. He sneered at him again, "See if there's anything here." Then he suddenly plunged down. The whole pagoda immediately collapsed with a rumble. Thick smoke and dust gushed out from the windows of the pagoda, as if a giant god in the sky had thrown a stone at the top of the pagoda. In an instant, Li Yunxin used his strong body to pierce through the pagoda from top to bottom, smashing it. Smoke and dust filled the sky, quickly forming a mushroom cloud. In the next moment, a figure broke through the clouds and shot towards the southeast. Su Xing finally got angry. He didn't chase after Li Yunxin anymore. Instead, he glanced down and saw a thin, craggy stone by the lake. He reached out and waved at the thin stone. Formation. Light appeared and spiritual energy surged. The surrounding area suddenly darkened, as if the sunlight was sifted through by an invisible sieve. Then he looked at Su Xing again. His hands and feet were plated with a layer of misty golden light, as if there was divine power attached to them. His feet slightly tapped in the air, and a 5-colored auspicious cloud lifted him up high into the sky. He stretched out his left hand again and a lot pot appeared in his palm. His face was as calm as water and his voice was like a great bell. "Li Yunxin, you want a magic treasure? I'll show you this one." Then he pointed at Li Yunxin in the distance with his right hand. 5th gate. Li Yunxin originally went straight to a huge 3-story palace with heavy eaves. The palace had big red walls and gold and jade tiles. It was surrounded by 3 white jade pillars, and there were 2 wide dragon and phoenix paths in front of the palace. It looked extremely majestic. If it was destroyed, it would definitely look even more majestic when it collapsed. But when Su Xing said those 3 words, it was as if he ran into an invisible barrier. He was only a few feet away from the top of the palace, but he couldn't fly over. Then 5 huge gods in bright armor appeared around him. They looked angry and raised their hands to catch him. Li Yunxin didn't even think and punched them. His whole body was about the size of the 5 gods' fists. However, the moment he punched out, the celestial being's body started to sway and was almost destroyed by him. The other 4 grabbed him tightly, restraining him. But Li Yunxin punched and kicked them again. In just 2 breaths' time, the 5 gods' bodies were destroyed, and they quickly turned into a golden light and disappeared. He laughed coldly. "This is your magic treasure?" Su Xing was neither happy nor angry. He sighed and hesitated for a while. Then he turned his finger. A lot flew out from the lot holder in his left hand. When the lot flew into the air, it immediately turned into hundreds of soldiers in golden armor, each holding a weapon, and charged at Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin shouted bravely in the air, This kind of trash, no matter how many come, I will kill them all. As soon as he finished speaking, his arms suddenly lit up with electricity, and he charged straight into the formation. But when he defeated the 5 gods, it looked like he was playing around. Now, it was a little more difficult to fight these hundreds of soldiers. After a quarter of an hour, all of them were blasted away, and his body was covered with cuts and bruises. Especially his face. After his rebirth, his face was thin and fragile. Now that he was in a forest of swords and spears, his face was full of blood and wounds, and it looked very scary. But it was only scary to look at. She reached out and wiped her face, revealing the tender pink face underneath. He didn't even need to wash his face. Both spells failed, but Su Sheng still didn't change his expression. Seeing that Li Yunxin was approaching him, he moved his fingers again, and 2 more lots flew out, turning into hundreds of soldiers that were the same as before. But this time it took Li Yunxin a lot more effort to kill them than last time. He had learned some martial arts since he was young, so his attacks were very methodical, and he didn't randomly punch and kick like the hooligans in the market. But when he killed them for the 3rd time, he gradually found that the soldiers formed by the golden light were actually a little similar to him. But before he just killed them casually, but now he was serious. In less than 15 minutes, this group was also cleared by him, and he continued to charge at Su Sheng. Okay, I will tie you up first and then I will find mine. Su Sheng didn't change his expression, and he turned his fingers 3 times. Then 3 more lots flew out of the lot pot in his left hand, turning into hundreds of heavenly weapons. Now looking at these hundreds of heavenly weapons, it was even more obvious. Not only were their fighting methods almost exactly the same as Li Yunxin's, even their originally blurry faces were very similar to Li Yunxin's. These heavenly weapons were getting more and more difficult to deal with. At this time, Li Yunxin was already fighting hard with 120% of his spirit, but he was still in a difficult situation. At this time, Su Sheng said in a deep voice, "This magic treasure is called the Ruyao Lot. If you use 1 part of your strength to give it, it will save 1 part of its strength. What kind of fighting method you use, it will slowly learn to fight in the same way. If you haven't reached the Grand Supreme Realm, it will eventually use the same kind of magical power you use. Li Yunxin, the more you fight now, the harder it will be to defeat it next time. Why are you still messing around?" But Li Yunxin was determined. He clenched his teeth and didn't say anything, only gathering his remaining courage, looking as if he was going to win again. So Su Sheng sighed again, his fingers moving again. This time another 3 lots flew out. In the air they turned into 3 golden armored deities who looked more like Li Yunxin, 1 on the left, 1 on the right, and 1 at the back. They flew through the crowd and grabbed Li Yunxin firmly. Li Yunxin tried to struggle, but he couldn't break free for a while. This was bad. The heavenly generals who were fighting with him also turned into streams of light and entered the bodies of the 3 people. At this time he couldn't even move. At this time Su Sheng's brows relaxed a little. He stared at Li Yunxin, who was gritting his teeth for a while, then said, "Li Yunxin, tell me, although you're not a kind person, you're not unreasonable either. But this matter, why are you so crazy and crazy? Everything you did before was to protect yourself. But now, not only can you protect yourself, you're even taking the initiative. Tell me, at this time should you take these treasures? If you take these treasures, will the wandering souls of the Freemasonry chase you to the end? Is it possible to drag you out again?" Li Yunxin couldn't break free no matter how hard he tried, so he simply stopped moving. Now that he heard Su Sheng ask these questions again, he sneered, "Yes, it's possible. So what?" Su Sheng glared at him. "Then why do you have to do this? You want to save your demon generals? I can lead you to get soul return pills. You can take as many as you want. If you want demonic energy, I can lead you to get some pills. It's harmless to the body to eat them, and it's not a waste to use them on you. But the treasures left behind by the saints on Cloud Mountain belong to the Taoist sect. Even if it's temporarily controlled by the Freemasonry, one day the Taoist sect will still be the Taoist sect. But if you take them away, can you guarantee that you can protect these treasures? Won't they fall into the hands of bad people? Can you?" Li Yunxin laughed heartily. "Ha! Bad people. To you, aren't the biggest bad people in the world those wandering souls? Keeping them in their hands. Is it better than keeping them in my hands?" Su Sheng raised his eyebrows. "Cloud Mountain will recover one day. At that time, this Cloud Mountain will still be the Taoist sect's Cloud Mountain. But if it leaks out, sigh." "Li Yunxin, are you playing dumb?" Li Yunxin suddenly laughed. "Good. You want to know what's wrong with me? I'll tell you now." Chapter 504. After laughing, he narrowed his eyes and stared at Su Sheng. It's because you said it too lightly. Recover Yunshan. The bodies of the two sages were destroyed. They wandered for thousands of years like lonely ghosts. Now they dare to sneak back with the help of a nobody like me. The Freemasonry has taken control of nearly half of the Dongtian school. The other half has either died or left. It's on the verge of collapse. Now the demons have attacked to the foot of Yunshan. It's almost a hopeless situation. Under such circumstances, even if Yunshan is defended, most of the Taoist priests and swordsmen are dead. Not to mention the whole world is divided and the foundation is shaken. Under such circumstances, you told me to recover Yunshan and not to touch those treasures. Let me ask you, where do you get your confidence from? Su Sheng smiled and was about to speak. Li Yunxin looked at him fiercely. I'm just a pawn of yours, right? You're still hiding something from me? Su Sheng blinked and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. They looked at each other for a while. Su Sheng let out a sigh. Why do you say that? Do you think I'm a fool? Li Yunxin looked at him. The people of Munanju also used me and treated me as a pawn. But at least you didn't insult my IQ. You've done a good job of keeping up appearances. You carried me in a fancy sedan chair and called me Dragon King. What about you? Your other reincarnation, Su Weng, went to Dongting Lake in my dragon palace to rebuild a body for Lu Ling. Li Yunxin shook his head and laughed at himself. At that time I thought maybe you were a master of the Dongtian school. You wanted to save Lu Ling because you loved her. I even thought that Su Weng was the incarnation of the sage. Before Lu Ling got out of Yunshan, she was summoned to the two sages and was given many magic treasures. Maybe that was why the sage wanted to save her. But later I learned that the sage was long dead. Li Yunxin sneered. Since the saint is a wandering soul of the Freemasons, he won't save Lu Ling. Who was that Su Weng? After that, I met you and knew that Su Weng was indeed another reincarnation of you, the master of calligraphy. Moreover, the body he remolded for Lu Ling through my dragon palace is called the Six Desires Tribulation Physique. It's exactly what the two wandering souls of the Freemasons want at all costs. Then tell me. Amir Lu Ling actually required the tribulation body of a saint to personally deal with him. To use such a mysterious method to reconstruct her body. Who is this Lu Ling? Li Yunxin glared at him. You are the reincarnation of the sage of calligraphy. Then, where was Sword Saint Zhuamuji's tribulation body? Don't you realize that ever since I met you, I've been asking all sorts of questions and never mentioned the Sword Saint's reincarnation? Do you think I'm a fool and have forgotten her? Su Sheng frowned. After a moment of silence he said, I see. Alas, if I did that thing back then I wouldn't have done it like Su Weng. After all, the tribulation he went through was different from mine, so he did things more casually. But you said that I treated you as a fool because of that, which is also a criticism. Li Yunxin sneered again and interrupted him. What happened after that? Su Weng left a message saying that I sent her to live in seclusion and let her live as an ordinary person for the rest of her life. I didn't want to care about these things. But I thought that Su Weng might have a profound background and that Lu Ling had died in my hands before, so there was no irreconcilable enmity between us. So I sent her to Chui Gang. At that time I still thought that Su Weng did things according to his heart. Perhaps it's because an expert wouldn't understand the sufferings of an insignificant person. Lu Ling used to be a cultivator. Now she has become an ordinary person, but the foundation of cultivation is still there in her mind. Isn't this kind of person good material to be a wandering soul of the Freemasons? As a wandering soul, her cultivation will definitely improve by leaps and bounds. It would be strange if the Freemasons didn't catch her. Li Yunxin paused, but at that time I couldn't be bothered to care about it. After all, I didn't owe her anything or have any friendship with her. After that, she was indeed taken away by the Freemasons. So actually, you already knew that the Freemasons would do this. Am I right? You wanted the Freemasons to take Lu Ling away so that she could infiltrate their ranks. And you are now in Mount Shaoyan. The two of you actually have other plans, one inside and one outside. That's why you confidently told me about the restoration of Mount Shaoyan and how you can't let those things leak out. Because until now, you still regard the things on Mount Shaoyun as your private property. So you don't feel bad when I destroy the things of two wandering souls. But now that I'm going to destroy yours and take yours, you feel bad, don't you? His tone was very sharp when he said this. Su Sheng listened to his words quietly, then he sighed softly. These words of yours, Li Yunxin, I'm afraid you've hidden them in your heart for a long time. So it's precisely because of this that you think I'm using you. So when I told you not to take the magic treasure of Mount Shaoyin, you flared up? Li Yunxin snorted and laughed. The sound came from his chest, very dull. Do you know what I'm most upset about? He slowly calmed down. But his gradually turning golden eyes seemed to ignite a ball of fire. What I'm most upset about is, you people always think that I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to participate in your game. Even though I'm already in the game, you still treat me as a chess piece. Those two wandering souls treat me as a chess piece. That person from Munanju keeps saying that he's my ally, but in fact he still treats me as a chess piece. As for you, Grandpa Calligrapher, you still treat me as a chess piece. Su Xing shook his head. The world is like a game. In this world, who isn't a chess piece? Ah, that's right. You people treat the world as a chess game. In this game there are several chess players staring at each other, each with their own thoughts, using all the power they can to defeat the other party. From the beginning to the end, your vision is only focused on the opponent. As for the others, those who are used by you as chess pieces, you've never cared about them. Li Yunxin grinned, revealing her fangs that had become slightly sharper. For example, look at me now. What I'm most upset about is being looked down upon by you people. I've done so many things and settled so many things. But now I find that I'm actually just a step in the big picture of you and that Lu Ling. Your vision is on the Freemasonry, on the future. I'm just a chess piece in the eyes of you, Munanju, isn't that right? Su Xing frowned and looked at him. He didn't answer his question but said, Li Yunxin, you've forgotten yourself. You're very good at playing with people's hearts. Now, don't you know that your current mood and appearance are like a child's? Children in the secular world always want to be recognized by others. Once they've been ignored for a long time, they'll make a big fuss. Look at yourself now, isn't that the case? Li Yunxin immediately spat. So what if I am? I'll tell you the truth, I feel very wronged and upset. I'm upset about you and I'm also upset about Munanju. In addition, I really want to step all of you under my feet in the future, and then ask you if you feel that you've done wrong today, looking down on me like a snob. Su Xing shook his head and smiled faintly. I hope that day will come for you. But Li Yunxin, you can't do that today. Today you can be at ease for the time being. I'll bring you out of Little Cloud Mountain and bring your 2 demon generals with me. After that, you can find a secluded place and quietly observe the changes here. Li Yunxin sneered again. Can't do it today? I'm going to take all the treasures today. Su Xing sighed as if he was looking at a willful child. Fine, fine, fine. Whatever you say. But before he could finish, he was suddenly interrupted. What interrupted him were 5 words. There were 3 groups in total. Horseshoe. Su Xing was stunned. Then he heard the second group, blossoming flower. He suddenly realized something and immediately moved his fingers. But the last word was read out before he could use it. God. Su Xing's expression suddenly froze and his body froze. Then, the lot pot in his left hand suddenly turned into a spot of light and disappeared. The 3 demon generals that were restraining Li Yunxin also disappeared. Su Xing's body fell from the sky like a wooden stake, smashing into the ground and raising a large amount of dust. Li Yunxin narrowed his eyes and landed in front of him. In fact, Su Xing could now see Li Yunxin's boots, right next to his face. He could also see the tiniest dust on the boots, and he could feel and understand everything in this world. But he couldn't control his reincarnated body. It was as if his consciousness was forced behind the scenes by some power, and he became a complete bystander. Li Yunxin lowered his head and looked at his face. After a while he said softly, Unfortunately, you didn't work in my line of work. It's also a pity that you people are too confident in yourselves. I guess you used to think that my methods weren't that big of a deal. You are just a reincarnated body. If you want to cut it, you will just have to go through the tribulation again. But if you were me, you would know that don't give people like me a chance to play tricks in your head. Now listen to me. I will count to 3 and you will feel that I am a person worthy of complete trust. You will also feel that there is nothing wrong with leaving all the treasures on Cloud Mountain to me for safekeeping. Moreover, after I say goodbye to you, I will forget everything that has happened today, as well as everything that has to do with me. Now listen to me. 3, 2, 1. Su Xing took a deep breath and blinked like he was spasming for a while. He slowly climbed up from the ground. He looked confused as if he couldn't understand many things. He stared at Li Yunxin. What did you do to me? Li Yunxin tilted his head and stared at him for a while. He smiled. I brainwashed you. Just like what I did to you in the Qing army camp. Now let's get down to business. Where are the treasures and all kinds of spirit pills and miraculous medicines left behind by the saints on the floating mountain? Su Sheng replied without hesitation. Some are in the Qian Hall in the north. Others are in the Kuan Hall in the south. Most of the pills are in the Qi Hall. There are restrictions and guards in all three places, but I know the way to break them. It isn't difficult to take things out. If you want to take them all, you can use the Linglong Pagoda inside to store them. The Linglong Pagoda can be big or small, so it is convenient for you to carry it on you. When he said these words, his tone was smooth and sincere. However, the expression on his face was extremely strange. As he spoke in this tone, his eyebrows were furrowed in anger. It was as if there was another him in his body that wanted to rush out and shut his mouth. Li Yunxin didn't care about his expression. He smiled. Okay, take me there. Su Sheng didn't hesitate and walked away. Just like this, the two of them walked for about a dozen steps. Su Sheng suddenly stopped. The moment he stopped, Li Yunxin, who was behind him, immediately stepped back and at the same time dodged to the side. He dodged the incomparably sharp light that Su Sheng raised his hand and swept behind him. This light brushed the bottom of his feet and flew out. It swept a distance of dozens of feet and rushed into the already muddy lake with a bang, stirring up waves that shot into the sky. If this had swept across Li Yunxin's body, he probably wouldn't be able to get up for a while and would be captured without a fight. However, he dodged it and laughed loudly. Good, good, good. You are a sage after all. You are used to face tribulations. This layer can't trap you. It only trapped him for less than the time it took for half an incense stick to burn. Now Su Sheng turned around and his face was really angry. Li Yunxin. Although I hid something from you, I didn't want to hurt you. And now you are so stubborn about this matter with me. Today I am here and you can't take anything away. Now, the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher was really angry. When he looked at Li Yunxin before, he only thought that he was an interesting junior and a willful kid. Most of the time he tolerated and indulged Li Yunxin. At least he thought that was the case. He wouldn't really get angry because of Li Yunxin's actions. But now, it seemed that someone had done something to his brain. How could he tolerate this kind of thing? As soon as he finished speaking, he didn't do anything. Instead, he flew to the north. Li Yunxin knew what he was trying to do with one look. This reincarnation had a strong body, but it didn't have any supernatural power. It could only be borrowed. But borrowed things might not be useful in fighting. It was better to use the magic treasures and formations that were set up on Cloud Mountain like what he did just now. Now that he was going to the north, there must be a strong restriction formation in the north. How could he let him get what he wanted? He sneered and chased after him. Of course, he didn't know where the formations were set up. But there was another way. Destroy everything you saw that was suspicious. Not to mention supernatural power, Li Yunxin's Long Jiu was stronger than the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher. Everywhere the two of them passed, the pavilions, palaces, and halls were all reduced to ruins. Su Sheng seemed to be afraid of falling into Li Yunxin's trap again. When he flew to the north, he tore off 2 pieces of his clothes and stuffed them into his ears, pretending to be a deaf person. Along the way they destroyed everything. In just a dozen breaths' time they ran for several miles. Then he saw an incomparably huge ornamental watch. This Chinese watch stood on a big square like a needle on a sundial. However, this needle was over 100 feet tall and as thick as a dozen people's arms. It was strange. When they were far away they couldn't see anything. They could only see that the square was empty and there were no buildings. But once Li Yunxin followed Su Sheng and stepped into the square, the huge Chinese watch suddenly appeared, as if it jumped out from some space. At this moment he knew something was wrong. Looking at the golden light on the Chinese watch, it must have an amazing spiritual power. And it appeared so suddenly, Su Sheng must have calculated that he couldn't see it and wanted to lead him in. But it was too late when he wanted to retreat. A slight buzzing sound was heard, and a huge light shield appeared above the square, covering the two of them. Su Sheng didn't hesitate and waved at the Chinese watch. Formation. There were embossments on the Chinese watch. On the pillar there was a monster that looked like a dragon but not a dragon, like a fish but not a fish. Other than this monster there was also a crane. It was beside the monster that looked like a fish but not a dragon. And, even though Li Yunxin was shocked and panicked, he still noticed Su Sheng's gaze. When Su Sheng saw the Chinese watch he was happy that Li Yunxin was lured here. Then he was surprised that the appearance of the Chinese watch had changed. But at this critical moment, Li Yunxin didn't think too much and neither did Su Sheng. So, the room fell into an awkward silence. Li Yunxin wanted to leave but he couldn't. Su Sheng waved his hand, but the Chinese watch didn't move. The formation he mentioned didn't respond to him. The two of them stared at each other for a moment. Then Li Yunxin turned around and pounced at him. Su Sheng retreated to the side of the Chinese watch and flicked the pillar. A burst of golden light shone, and the two embossments on the Chinese watch suddenly became lively, as if they were about to come out. Su Sheng shouted, "Go!" The two figures immediately broke free from the Chinese watch and fell to the ground. Li Yunxin didn't know whether the two figures that Su Sheng summoned from the Chinese watch were divine beasts that were used to form a formation. So, when he saw the two figures coming towards him, he waved his palms and was about to attack them. But at this critical moment he saw the faces of the two figures clearly. He grunted and retracted his strength. The wind from his palms brushed past the two figures' shoulders and exploded to the side. The two figures were not strangers. They were Bai Yunxin and Hong Yangzi. The three of them bumped into each other and fell to the ground in a tangled mess. Taking a breather, Su Sheng flicked the Chinese watch again. The huge Chinese watch that was more than 100 feet tall immediately turned into a small flagpole and fell from the air into his hand. He held the treasure firmly, then heaved a sigh of relief and turned to look at the three people on the ground. I was wondering why this demon execution banner didn't listen to me. It turns out that it sealed the two of you. As he said this, he held the treasure in his hand again, but he didn't attack again. Because, he was slightly shocked. There were very few things that could shock the sage of calligraphy, and now he had encountered one. The demon execution banner in his hand was not the most powerful among the treasures of the Xianmen, but it was the most famous. But it was not famous because of its outstanding military achievements, but because of a big demon. The first big demon in the Grand Supreme Realm, the Golden Rock King. This magic treasure was originally refined because the Golden Rock had become a big demon in the Grand Supreme Realm, so the sage wanted to keep it, so he refined it. Unfortunately, before this thing was used, the Xianmen and the Golden Rock had a tacit understanding. It was born for the Grand Supreme Demon, but it had never been used. Therefore, it was later set up in this square, and could be considered one of the major formations of the mountain. Just now, when Su Sheng reached out to summon it, it didn't listen. There were two possibilities for this situation. One was that it was broken. The other was that it was carrying a weight that it couldn't bear. Now he knew that it was the second possibility. This demon execution banner had sealed Red Lady and Bai Yunxin. All the spiritual power in the banner was used to suppress these two demons, so it had no time to listen to the summons. The problem was, Bai Yunxin was in the true realm. To this demon execution banner, she was just a sesame seed on a cattail leaf fan. How could he ask this magic treasure to use all the spiritual power? Then the strange thing was with Red Lady. Su Sheng knew that there was a dragon soul sealed in her body. But since the dragon soul was sealed, it meant that it was similar to a dead object. For example, fruits and seeds. The weight was there, but you couldn't say that it was a fruit tree or a flower. The dragon soul was similar. For example, when a person was alive, these bones and flesh formed a person, and you could call it a person. But when it died, the flesh and blood were still flesh and blood, and it could only be called a corpse. The dragon soul in Shinryu's body was considered a dragon soul. But it was separated and sealed, and it couldn't be fused or revived, so it became a dead object. There were many secrets involved in this, and it was very mysterious. He could only think about it roughly at the moment. Then Red Lady, who had the dragon soul sealed, was just a red lady with a dead object. Or a small transformative state fish spirit. But this demon execution banner didn't listen to his summons, and was suppressed by these two demons. Su Sheng was startled. He stared at Hong Yangzi without saying anything. At this time, Li Yunxin had already stood up. He hesitated for a while and reached out to pull Bai Yunxin and Red Lady up. The two demonesses looked to be in a rather sorry state at this moment. They looked very weak. The demon-slaying banner was a treasure that could borrow strength to fight strength. It absorbed the demon's demonic power and used it to restrain the demon's body. It was similar to the bright stick that Su Sheng had used to deal with Li Yunxin. In reality, the two of them were indeed components of another Dao artifact. Therefore they had been restrained by their own power for many days, and they were exhausted. Bai Yunxin seemed to be in good spirits. As soon as she got free and stood up, she immediately stared at Su Sheng with her black eyes and shouted, "Damn Taoist! How dare you capture me?" Her voice was sharp and high-pitched, and it made people's heads go numb. But with such momentum, there was nothing she could do. This floating mountain had sealed off her supernatural powers. She also saw the demon-slaying banner in Su Sheng's hands and didn't know his actual strength, so she restrained her demonic temperament and didn't make a move. Looking at Red Lady, she didn't look good. Chapter 505. Her face was pale and her cheeks were sunken. She used to be a beautiful woman, but now she was as haggard as a withered willow that had been beaten by the wind and rain. But she was still conscious. She stood in front of Li Yunxin and stared at him with squinted eyes for a while before she could see his face clearly. Then she was stunned for a while, like an old man with a confused mind, before she opened her mouth. "Ah, Li Lang." After saying this, she couldn't stand still. Her body softened and she was about to fall into his arms. She wasn't putting on an act like other women. And it seemed that she really couldn't make it. When Li Yunxin saw her in the palace of hatred, his mind had been eroded by the dragon soul. Now after these days it looked even worse. He subconsciously reached out to hold her, but in the end he dodged to the side and only held her. After holding her, he put his shoulder into Bai Yunxin's arms. "Take care of her. I still have things to do." Bai Yunxin stared at him. "Do you think I am? Did you kidnap her?" Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng and walked slowly while saying to Bai Yunxin, "Besides, you have been collecting flood dragon meat for so many years. Don't you know her well? Since you've kidnapped him, shouldn't you have a start and an end?" Bai Yunxin heard his words and shouted again, "Li Yunxin." After saying this, he looked at Red Lady. "This little fish is going to die. If you leave like this, you won't be able to see her again." Li Yunxin frowned and glanced at Red Lady. "If I stay here, she will also die. I went to get some precious elixir, maybe it can save her life." Bai Yunxin wanted to say something. But Red Lady seemed to have a terminal lucidity. She temporarily regained her consciousness and happened to hear Li Yunxin's words. She said in Bai Yunxin's arms, "Li Lang, you go. I know you still have important things to do. It's a pity." Sigh. Having said this, she fell into a stupor again, as though a veil were drifting over her brain, and would give her only a limited time to speak to the person of whom she had been thinking day and night. If it was someone else who saw her like this, perhaps their heart would soften and they would chat with her. But it had to be Li Yunxin. In many people's eyes, Li Yunxin didn't have any emotions in his heart. Everything he had was to be used. However, the current Lu Gongzan might have a different opinion. If Lu Gongzan saw this scene, he would probably shake his head. His brother Xian, just as he had said, did not like to speak his mind to others. Even if, now he really felt a trace of pity for this Red Lady and a trace of indistinct feelings, however, it would also make him avoid her even further. This was because this kind of emotion would always make him subconsciously panic. It seemed that he still hadn't learned how to grasp and control it. Perhaps because of this, an invisible and untouchable art saint that only existed in history and clues could become some kind of emotional sustenance for him. Because of this, he didn't need to face such a person. Thus, Li Yunxin only vaguely responded with an N. Red Lady slowly came back to her senses and continued what she had just said. She said in a low voice, "Sigh, it's a pity. When my father saw me for the last time, he told me that maybe I could help you in the future. Who knew that I would only become a burden now? If I can really help you, Li Lang." She turned to look at Su Sheng and weakly raised her finger to point at the demon execution banner in his hand. "That banner suppresses the dragon soul in my body. It's already stagnant. I guess it's of no use now. You have to be careful. Come back soon." At this point, Su Sheng subconsciously glanced at the demon-slaying banner in his hand. It was also at this moment that Li Yunxin suddenly launched an attack and fiercely pounced towards him. In an instant the two of them collided. Su Sheng originally wanted to trap Li Yunxin, and Li Yunxin originally wanted to catch up to him. Now that the two of them were in the same restriction, it could be considered as a close combat. However, the two of them didn't want to kill each other. Li Yunxin wanted to get the method to break the restriction of the 3 halls from him. Su Sheng didn't have any big grudges with him, but they were friends. Although Li Yunxin was stubborn, it wasn't good to kill him unless it was absolutely necessary. At least, he was a dragon son who could use some supernatural powers in this restriction. If they really fought to the death, it was really unknown who would be the winner in the end. Therefore, after another 3 breaths, the huge restriction that enveloped the square suddenly dissipated. Su Sheng broke it, withdrew to avoid Li Yunxin's attack and turned to the east as if to find another restriction. Li Yunxin naturally chased after him. Therefore, wherever the two of them passed, they raised a large amount of smoke and dust, as if there was an angry giant beast running wildly in this floating mountain. It really didn't know how many strange landscapes and precious treasures were destroyed. When the two of them came, they were like a gust of wind. After a short pause, they also left like a gust of wind. Bai Yunxin stared at the direction the two of them went for a while, and then lowered her head to look at Red Lady in her arms. The fish spirit's body was completely limp, and she was relying on Bai Yunshin to hold her. He Yao sighed and slowly sat on the ground, letting Red Lady lie down with her legs as a pillow. Then he stared left and right at her face for a while and said, "You are really stupid. But I don't blame you. Who told you to be a yin cultivator?" She said this and then gritted her teeth. "Don't blame me for taking you away. At that time your Dongting, your father was also gone, and a group of demons and people of Shenmen were eyeing you covetously. It was not a good situation for you to stay there. I took you away for your own good." But Red Lady just stared at her. She didn't know whether she heard it but had no strength to speak, or she didn't hear it at all. Bai Yunshin was silent for a while and then said, "Alas. In the words of human beings, you also have a hard life. Your monarch father treats you like a plaything. I don't even know why he gave birth to you. Speaking of this, my adoptive father." "But my adoptive father was better than your father. He refined the dragon soul in you. What did he think you were? I have taken the flood dragon meat from you all these years. Although we are not close friends, I know this kind of thing and I also feel unfair." Red Lady opened her mouth and no one knew what she said. But Bai Yunshin didn't try to listen to it carefully. She was talking to Red Lady now, which looked like a sister in the secular world, complaining and chatting. But she was not a woman in the secular world, but a demon who would slaughter the whole city if she was not happy. Now she said this to Red Lady just because she wanted to say it, but not mainly to feel for Red Lady and comfort her. There was a subtle but huge difference between them and the people in the secular world. Therefore she didn't hear it clearly and she didn't bother to listen. She just touched Red Lady's face and continued, "I said you are stupid. Alas, are you stupid or crazy? You can't forget Li Yunshin, but look at him just now. When he was about to leave he didn't even look at you. Little fish, do you think he knew that when he came back he would only see a corpse?" After a long time, Red Lady opened her mouth again, making some meaningless syllables. But Bai Yunshin couldn't hear what she was saying. She sighed pitifully for a while and then said, "Forget it. Li Yunshin doesn't care about you, let me try." After saying this she was about to get up and help the fish spirit up. But she was stunned. Because she realized that the Red Lady who was lying on her lap had already died at some point in time. There was no vitality and her breath was cut off. Chapter 506. After a person died, their vitality would be cut off, leaving only a corpse. Soon the corpse would rot and only bones would be left. After a few years the bones would also turn into dust. What about after a demon died? There were many people who died in the hands of Bai Yunshin, and there were also many demons. She didn't have any feelings about life and death. Therefore when she saw that Red Lady was dead she was just stunned for a while. Then she sighed. This poor little fish. The reason why she said those words of pity to the red carp inside now was because of two things. First, when she was caught by Ku Chanzi, she didn't know whether her maid Little Shell was dead or alive. After all, they had been together for many years, so she had some feelings for her. Therefore she couldn't help being a little sentimental. Second, she remembered that her adoptive father said that he would marry her to dragons. Compared to Red Lady's father, who roasted her on the true fire and refined the dragon's soul into her body, it could be said that they were in the same boat. But now that she was dead there was nothing she could do. Bai Yunshin sighed, then stood up and didn't look at her anymore. She was thinking about where to go. She knew that this place was Little Cloud Mountain. She could also feel that the demon power in her body was all restricted. This meant that this place was extremely dangerous, and there might be a large number of stinky Taoists lying in ambush wherever she went. But that Li Yunshin seemed to be fearless. It was really a little strange. Therefore she couldn't make up her mind. But the next moment, Bai Yunshin suddenly let out a soft, "Ha!" She turned around and looked at Red Lady. Red Lady's corpse was actually still there. She blinked and furrowed her brows. Previously, it was said that the demons in this world could also be called Yin gods. It was also said that there were three kinds of Yin gods. The first kind was like Bai Yunshin, who was born with cultivation. This was the Khanate demon. The second kind was like the Golden Rock King and Lord Dongting, who were born with the body of a beast, and then gained spiritual wisdom and Tao. This was the postnatal demon. The third kind was the ghost cultivator. When a person died, their soul cultivated the ghost Tao. They were ghost cultivators. When Khanate and post-celestial demons died, their souls cultivated the ghost Tao, which made them ghostly cultivators. Wanderer Bai and Red Madam were both of them. The wandering souls of the Freemasons were also very similar to ghost cultivators. However, they were refined using a different method, so they were not considered as humans, nor could they be considered as demons. Bai Yunxin had killed the innate demon, the postnatal demon, and the ghost cultivator, Bai Yunxin. That was why he knew that the Khanate demons might not show their true bodies after they died. When a post-celestial demon dies, it will definitely reveal its true body. For example, the old fox demon Li Yunxin killed in Manwan Mountain. Once a ghost cultivator died, his body would dissipate. This was because ghosts only had souls to begin with, and the so-called physical body was also a form that was simulated by the soul. If he died a second time, the damage to his soul would be even more severe, and it would be impossible for him to cultivate again. Once the soul dissipated, the corpse would naturally dissipate as well. Therefore, among the three kinds of Yin spirits, ghost cultivators were the ones who couldn't die the most. The first two kinds had the possibility of cultivating again after death, but ghost cultivators were really dead when they died. Red Madam was naturally a ghost cultivator. She was also a Khanate demon before. After she was killed, her soul cultivated into this extremely obsessed salted fish spirit. Now she died because her soul was eroded by the dragon soul. Even if the soul dissipated, the body wouldn't dissipate. However, her body did not dissipate. Therefore, Bai Yunxin made a sound of surprise, and a rare look of hesitation appeared on her face. She couldn't decide whether she should check Red Madam's breath again, or... The next moment, her eyes suddenly turned pure black and widened. Like a cat that had suddenly seen a terrible beast, she took a step back as if she had been electrocuted, and clenched her teeth tightly. Because she suddenly felt a terrible aura. The aura came from Red Madam's corpse. 2 breaths later, the carp spirit that was supposed to be dead opened its eyes again. She stared unblinkingly at the zenith for a long time. Then she exhaled softly, turned over slowly and stood up from the ground. Bai Yunxin looked at her cautiously and lifted her feet gently. She had never had such a feeling. It was a wonderful, unknown, and extremely dangerous feeling. The Red Madam she saw now was still the Red Madam from before. There was no change in her appearance. If there was a difference, it was that her complexion had become better. Her skin became delicate and glossy again, and there was no trace of haggard. But the Red Madam seemed to have become a stranger at this moment. The Red Madam of the outer fringe, who was the recultivated fish spirit, was gone. Her body seemed to have been replaced by something else. Bai Yunxin knew that there was something else in her body, the dragon soul. But that dragon soul was a remnant soul. What was the essence of a soul? In fact, it was somewhat similar to a human body. It was a body with organs and bones. In the human body, each had its own function and could only function as a whole. If someone was missing an arm or a leg, the function of the body would be greatly affected. If half of the body was missing, the whole body would not be formed and would not be able to function. The spirit was originally hidden in the internal organs, meridians, and apertures, and was inseparable from the human body. When the human body was destroyed and the person died, the spirit would be separated from the human body. The incomplete spirit was called the soul. This soul was similar to the human body. If it was incomplete, it would be a remnant soul and it would be confused and muddle-headed. Even if one became a ghost cultivator, the incomplete soul would never be able to be repaired, and it would become an obsession. If the soul was incomplete, the mind would become more chaotic. If the chaos reached a certain level, it would become a ball of resentment, spiritual power, and the like. Since there was no conscious restraint, this ball of resentment, spiritual power, and so on would slowly dissipate. Bai Yunxin knew that half of Red Madam's body was the dragon soul, and so did many others. But the reason why these people dared to capture Red Madam was because they knew that the dragon soul was half, and it was like half a remnant body, and it had no consciousness. The so-called half of the dragon soul was just half of the sealed divine power that should have belonged to Shinryu. But now, what Bai Yunxin saw in front of her seemed to be far beyond the common sense. What was in Red Madam's body at this moment? She stood on her tiptoes and was ready to escape at any time. Then she saw Red Madam look at her. Her appearance did not change, but her temperament was completely different. In the past she was a pitiful person who missed Li Yunxin all the time, but now she was calm and serious. It was as if everything in her body had been peeled off, and the golden jade-like inner substance was revealed. I didn't expect that in the end, you would accompany me and say those words to me. Red Madam's voice also did not change. After saying this, her face was full of melancholy. Then she sighed, "Don't be afraid. Just because of what you said to me before, I won't harm you." Bai Yunxin slightly frowned. She noticed that Red Madam still called herself me. So she whispered, "Who are you?" Red Madam smiled, "I am Red Madam. Red Madam is dead." Bai Yunxin looked at her. Her soul was eroded by the dragon's soul. She is dead. Red Madam was silent for a while. She looked into the distance. She looked like a person who suddenly remembered something in the past and felt a little confused. She let the past linger in her mind for a while and then said softly, "The former Red Madam is indeed dead." After saying this, 2 lines of tears flowed out of her eyes, like 2 streams of clear spring water, flowing to her cheeks and dripping down like pearls. She shed tears, but the look on her face and tone did not change at all. It was as if the body was sad but the soul was calm. "But I am still Red Madam. My father is the Lord Dongting of Dongting. I used to be a red carp and then I became a ghost cultivator. Now I am still me, Red Madam." After saying this to herself, she was silent for a while, as if she was recalling the past. Her appearance shocked Bai Yunxin. Bai Yunxin was a monster in the real realm. She could be regarded as a powerful monster in this world. However, she had traveled the world for 1,000 years, and she had also met many monsters who were stronger and more dangerous than her. Now she was safe and sound because of her keen intuition. Therefore, looking at the current Red Madam, she only felt that under her calm appearance, there was a kind of evil spirit that made people feel cold. She was definitely not Red Madam as she claimed. At least not completely. Thinking of this, the thought of retreating arose in his mind. Going anywhere, even if there were those stinky Taoist priests lying in ambush, it was still much more reassuring than staying by Red Madam's side. Therefore she took 2 steps back and whispered, "In this case, you are safe and sound. Let's say goodbye. This is Mount Shaoyin, not a place to stay for a long time. I'm going to find a way out." After saying this, she withdrew. In just one breath she flew 50 feet away. However, at this moment, a huge and uncontrollable force came. Her body was like a flying feather, and in the next moment she was pulled back, to the side of Red Madam. Although Bai Yunxin was panicking and tried to avoid it, she was not a gentle female monster after all. In this sudden change, the first thing she thought of was to make a move. She turned around and struck with her palms. No matter what the reason was, she would strike twice first. She was a monster in the real realm who was not seriously injured and had a strong monster power. Although she did not have any magical power at this moment, when she used all her strength to strike with her palms, the power was still amazing. However, these 2 palms were caught with a snap. That Red Madam opened her slender hand, her thumb pressed against Bai Yunxin's left palm, and her pinky pressed against Bai Yunxin's right palm, and caught it. Not only did she catch it, but also made both of Crane Demon's arms numb, as if she had been electrocuted, and she almost could not lift them up. Only then did she realize, this seemed to be really Red Madam. There was no other reason. This method of hitting her with 2 fingers was a secular martial art called Shaoyang Finger. Red Madam used to be a monster who loved the prosperity of the mortal world, and so did Bai Yunxin. It was just that these 2 demonesses had their own ways of loving each other. Bai Yunxin loved to join in the fun and liked to go to the city. But she was easy to be happy and easy to be angry. When she was happy, her appetite would increase and people would die. When she was angry, people would die. So although she knew a lot of things in the secular world, she just knew. But this Red Madam really knew how to get along with people and even learn some things. For example, the martial arts of the secular world. The martial arts of the secular world mostly taught the weak to defeat the strong, or taught the weak to become stronger. These things focused on details and techniques, and were of little value to the monsters and cultivators. As the saying goes, 1 strong man can defeat 10. The body of an emptiness realm cultivator was stronger than the most powerful top experts in the secular world, and there were many magical powers, so who would want to learn martial arts? But Red Madam liked the things in the secular world and she learned a lot. For example, when she chatted with Bai Yunxin, she mentioned several ways to learn to play. Shaoyang Finger was one of them. Now she used the martial arts of the secular world to easily take 2 palms from the monster crane. Bai Yunxin was shocked and took 2 steps back. She stared at Red Madam. "You?" Red Madam looked at her calmly. "For so many years, when you went to Dongting to get the flood dragon meat, I was the one who helped you. Although we didn't have a deep relationship, it was rare for a monster like us to get along with each other for many years without killing or swallowing each other. So we can be regarded as sisters, right? Since we are sisters, you said that you took me away from Dongting because you were afraid that I would be in danger. Now I don't want you to go. How could Mount Shaoyin not be a dangerous place? Sister Bai, come with me to find my Li Lang Yunxin." After saying this, she turned around and left. She was going to the direction where Li Yunxin and Su Sheng went. In fact, looking over there at this time, she could still see the smoke rising in the hall occasionally. Li Yunxin seemed to be fighting with Su Sheng to his heart's content. And the word "to his heart's content" seemed to be suitable for Li Yunxin now. Although he didn't have any supernatural power now and could only rely on his physical strength. However, compared with many times before, this time his opponent was indeed on par with him. In the past he always faced strong enemies and had to win by tricks. But now he could fight with all his strength and didn't need to worry about other factors. Therefore, the more he fought, the braver he became. This was the first time he experienced the joy of fighting. Red Madam went straight to Li Yunxin. Bai Yunxin was stunned for a while. Then she breathed a sigh of relief and slowly followed her. What else could she do? Now she realized that just now, Red Madam used supernatural power. She jumped 5 or 6 feet away, but Red Madam used supernatural power to pull her back. In this place, Red Madam still had supernatural power. She couldn't see this little fish at all. Moreover, she used to walk in front like this and Red Madam followed her obediently. Now the situation was reversed and their identities were also changed. She didn't know if Red Madam did this on purpose. But whether it was intentional or not, the dreadful aura coming from Red Madam's body still made her feel like this. In fact, she also wanted to see why Red Madam went to find Li Yunxin. Don't tell me he's going to find that heartless fellow for revenge. Chapter 507. At this time, Li Yunxin had already arrived in front of the Qin Hall. Compared to the many palaces on the floating mountain that he had destroyed, the layout of the Qin Hall was a bit smaller, and it wasn't as tall and magnificent as the other palaces. This was because the Qian and Kuan halls were the first buildings to appear on the floating mountain, and they had a history of 50,000 years. Even though the bricks and tiles used to build this hall weren't ordinary, they still couldn't resist the corrosion of time. But this made this hall seem more real, very much like those buildings in the secular world, unlike the palaces in other places which were all dazzling and shiny and didn't look like real buildings. But even though he had arrived, the door couldn't be opened. The door was a pair of wooden lattice doors, very ordinary. But now, Li Yunxin had already struck the door several times, but it still didn't budge as if it was cast from copper and iron. He wasn't the only one here. Su Sheng was here. Su Sheng was leaning on the stone drum on the steps in front of the door, with a broken leg and an arm, and looked at Li Yunxin in a daze. After he struck for the 13th time, he said, "You're wasting your energy." After saying this, he sighed again and his previous solemnity disappeared, as if he felt helpless towards Li Yunxin, but there really wasn't anything he could do. Probably only this kind of tribulation body would behave like this. If it wasn't for this tribulation body, if it wasn't at this time, and if they didn't have any previous friendship, perhaps they would have already fought to the death. If the restrictions on the Qin Hall were in the past, before the Fire Cloud sect's divine power was sealed off by the Fire Cloud sect, if you were to mess around like this, you would have already been devoured and destroyed. Now, although the power on it is only 1,000th or even a 10,000th of before, it's still not something you can open like this. Instead of wasting your energy here, why don't you listen to me? At this point he coughed twice and actually coughed up blood. Listen to me, go get some medicinal pills. Replenish your demon power, save your demon general, then leave the mountain and hide from the world. Why waste time for these things, for the anger in your heart? Li Yunxin turned his head and stared at him. In fact, Li Yunxin was also sitting in front of the door. Su Sheng had lost a leg and an arm, while Li Yunxin's legs were broken, but his arms were still intact. People like the two of them didn't care about ordinary minor injuries. In more serious cases, if one lost an arm or a leg, it would be easy to recover with enough demonic energy and spiritual energy. But now, he looked as miserable as a mortal, which meant that the demonic power and spiritual power in his body had been exhausted to the extreme, so the process of recovery had become very slow. As a result, Li Yunxin's face was covered in scars. However, this scar did not seem to affect his handsomeness. Instead, it added a trace of wildness to him, giving him a strange charm. He fiercely glared at Su Sheng for a while before gritting his teeth and saying, "You make it sound so easy." Then he used his arms to support his body against the door, took a few deep breaths and said, "Fine. Since it's like this, let me ask you, what was the original plan of you and Lu Ling?" It looked like he was really discouraged, so he gave up and wanted to ask for some inside information. Su Sheng was slightly stunned, then shook his head. "I can't tell you this kind of thing right now." Li Yunxin sneered, "What are you thinking about? Do you think I want to know? I'm not interested at all." The reason why I'm asking you is to give you a few words of advice so that you can see the reality. You said that I'm wasting time here, but I think you're wasting time here. Do you believe that no matter what plan the two of you originally had or what you plan to do now, there's a high chance that everything will go to waste? When that time comes, not only you won't be able to retrieve this small cloud mountain, even those two wandering souls won't be able to retrieve this small cloud mountain. At that time, will you regret that you didn't ask me to take the treasure away now? Su Sheng was stunned at first, then he smiled. At this time these tricks are useless. Li Yunxin didn't refute, just staring at him. After staring for a long time he suddenly said, "Do you know the ancient devil and the true devil?" Su Sheng still kept that kind of smile. "I don't know." This kind of smile was the smile of seeing through someone's little trick. This kind of smile was even a little sarcastic. Perhaps this slight sarcasm was not what the owner of the smile wanted to show, but now it was just to consume Li Yunxin's patience, so that he would give up this kind of deliberately mystifying trick earlier. But Li Yunxin was not annoyed at all. He first looked up at the sky. According to the sky, he had been in the small cloud mountain for more than 2 hours. There were about 4 hours left for him. So he looked at Su Sheng again, saying to himself, "When I was in Dongting, I went to the pitfall mountain of the evil king. There, I saw a big hole at the foot of the mountain. In the hole there was a skeleton sealed. It was a human, very big. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was very big. No matter if I or any other big monster showed their true form, they would all be so big. The problem was, it was a human." Li Yunxin paused. "Have you ever seen such a big person?" Su Sheng was still smiling. "Oh, no, I haven't." It was like, he just wanted to see what other tricks Li Yunxin could come up with. He didn't care, and Li Yunxin didn't care about his attitude either. He only continued, "One of the 8 treasures ancient scrolls was also there. In the hands of the evil king, to suppress the skeleton. But then the evil king died, so I took the scroll away." Su Sheng was a little moved when he mentioned one of the 8 treasures ancient scrolls. He knew that the fog sends slaves to Kaidamo was indeed in the hands of Li Yunxin. He even used it when he fought with Jin Guangzi. But that's not the point. Li Yunxin raised his hand and knocked on the door. "The point is, after the evil king died, his remnant soul. The evil king was a big monster in the mysterious realm. You should know that it's very difficult to destroy his remnant soul. But when his remnant soul ran to the skeleton, it couldn't resist, and was swallowed by the skeleton. I was scared silly, so I turned around and ran away. That's also because, what happened there had nothing to do with me. If something happened, there would always be the mysterious gate or those big monsters to support it. Even if the sky collapsed, it wouldn't be able to crush me. But guess what?" Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng quietly. "A few days ago, when I was in Hatred's lair in Manwan Mountain, I also saw a similar skeleton. I thought for a while and it should be the second one. After I was scared away by that thing in the pitfall mountain, I drew the 8 princes ghost subduing painting on the top of the mountain. I didn't ask for it to subdue that thing, but I wanted to know in advance if that thing really moved. I guess it's an idle move." Su Sheng finally stopped laughing when he heard this calmly. But there was still hesitation in his expression, as if he was considering whether Li Yunxin's unbelievable words were half true and half false, or if they were all true. But Li Yunxin still didn't care about his attitude, and only calmly and concisely stated a fact. For smart people, too much explanation would weaken the truth of the matter. Only an objective statement was the most convincing. "So I think the one in the Guanyuan cave where Hatred was in was the second one. Maybe it's their secret weapon, the trump card of this war." Li Yunxin said softly, "But actually there should be 2. Because after I escaped from the Guanyuan cave, I sensed that the 8 kings ghost subduing painting formation I set on the top of the pitfall mountain was destroyed. This means that the one in the pitfall mountain has left." Su Sheng blinked and frowned slightly. Li Yunxin said again, "Oh, there's one more thing. Previously the wild forest was set on fire and many creatures died in it. I collected the remnant souls, but actually, I only collected a small part of them. Any more than that and it would be beyond my ability. But these days, so what?" He smiled. "There's nothing special around here. I thought that since I didn't collect the rest of the souls in the wild forest, they must have gone out and wandered everywhere. But after I left the wild forest, I almost didn't see any souls. I'm not saying that it must be, I'm just guessing." Li Yunxin spread out his hands. "Are the disappeared souls related to the skeleton? Because looking at the appearance of the skeleton in the pitfall mountain, it seems that it will become stronger after swallowing souls." At this point, Su Sheng finally said, Are you telling the truth? Ancient devil?" I've never heard of. Now he was finally willing to verify the truth of the matter. But Li Yunxin was not in a hurry. He interrupted him, I'm not finished yet. Let's talk about what the two wandering souls said to me a few days ago. At that time, Su Yusong told me that the reason why I can use divine sense here is because of the demon seed in my body. He also told me that you guys caught many animals in Tongtian swamp and experimented on them, and created a golden rock king, right? Li Yunxin shook his head. When I heard the term demon seed, I felt it was familiar. It seemed to be not the first time I heard it. Then I thought for a while, and remembered where I heard it before. In the Pitfall Mountain. Before the evil king was swallowed by the skeleton, he told me that it was a demon seed born in the primitive world, an expert that existed before the chaos was divided. Even the celestial beings in heaven were afraid of this demon seed, so they scattered it and suppressed it between heaven and earth. Behind him was one of the remains of the ancient devil. At that time, I knew that it was just a remnant soul, muddle-headed and crazy, talking nonsense, so I didn't take it to heart. Li Yunxin paused as if thinking for a while, then said, at that time he said it was scattered. Then I saw another one in the Guanyuan crypt, which seemed to confirm his words. There is more than one. He said the word demon seed again. At that time, I only felt strange about one thing. That is, if this thing is really so scary, why is it not the people of the celestial sect guarding it but the demons? But I also thought that maybe only one or a few were guarded by the demons. Most of them were guarded by the celestial sect. But when I asked you just now, you said you don't know. Then, even the master of calligrapher doesn't know. One was guarded by the evil king, and the other appeared in the Guanyuan crypt. From this, I guess only the demons, a very small number of demons, know about this. Ancient devil, demon seed. Su Yusong also mentioned that the demon seed first appeared in the bodies of the demons. Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng. After hearing what I said, do you still think that I am deliberately mystifying things? At this time, the expression on Su Sheng's face was completely serious. He looked at Li Yunxin seriously. What you said is true? You have to know if what you said is true. No matter what I said about Lu Ling, no matter whether I allowed you to take those magic treasures or not, these are all minor details. The skeleton you mentioned is the biggest disaster. Is what you said true? Li Yunxin smiled. That's why I had a better impression of you when I first met you. Because you are not a bigot. You don't think that you are very smart and others' words are nonsense. Well then, since you are now asking me whether it is true or not, you must have a plan in your heart. After saying this, he stopped smiling and looked at Su Sheng. It is true. You think it is a big disaster, and I also think it is a big disaster. Zither Lady in Hatred's plan is probably to throw a large number of demon soldiers and generals into the battlefield to put pressure on the celestial sect. When the two sides are entangled, they will take out this. Let's call it the ancient devil's doppelganger. Then both the demons and cultivators will die, and they will get the remnant souls and resentment. But I think those guys are courting death. They don't know what they are doing at all. So, after I came out of Manwan Mountain, I made up my mind not to join the demons, the celestial sect and the Freemasonry, which are bound to lose. Because of this, I dared to boldly come to Cloud Mountain to raid their homes. Not many people can come back. After saying all this in one breath, Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng meaningfully. So I want to take the magic treasures. I said that I want to take the magic treasures to vent my anger. Or rather, on one hand, it is to vent my anger, and on the other hand, to preserve these things so that they will not be destroyed. Do you believe or not accept these two reasons? At this time, Su Sheng was a little stunned. He stared at Li Yunxin's face for a while, then frowned. You think that you can realize how dangerous that thing is, but Zither Lady in Hatred don't? Is it possible that they can actually control that thing? Or that the Celestials are afraid of it? Is the evil king just exaggerating? Li Yunxin held the door and slowly stood up. After all, he was a demon, so he recovered a little faster than Su Sheng. Now, although his legs were still a little stiff, he could already support his body. I understand. He chuckled. When people hear something they don't want to accept, they will instinctively grab at a life-saving straw. But for this matter, you have nothing to grab. The reason why I am very afraid of that thing, think that Zither Lady and the others are playing with fire, think that thing will definitely kill all the demons and cultivators, is because... He paused and looked at Su Sheng. This is the first time I have heard the words ancient devil, and true devil, not from the evil king, but from Bai Yanjun. Su Sheng frowned. He tilted his head and looked at Li Yunxin for a while, as if to make sure he didn't hear wrong. Yama King? Well, Li Yunxin smiled reservedly. We are good friends. Chapter 508. Su Sheng continued to frown and looked at him suspiciously. In fact, he wasn't sure if the Bai Yanjun mentioned by Li Yunxin was some kind of description, rhetoric, or something else. He couldn't really be referring to the two main gods in the Sanluo temple, could he? Even the saints, the most powerful beings in the world, had a hard time meeting the king of hell. The saints of the Shenmen held the power of the world, while the black Bai Yanjun held the life and death of the world. But at this moment he couldn't think of any other explanation. Since that was the case, he asked again in a solemn tone, Li Yunxin, you're telling me now, you heard the words true devil and ancient devil from the mouth of the king of hell? King of hell. The king of hell in the Sanluo underworld, the one in charge of life and death. Bai Yanjun? Li Yunxin smiled lightly and coughed lightly. Yes. That king of hell, but I usually call him Brother Bai. Speaking of this, he slowly walked to the front of Su Sheng and looked at him seriously. Otherwise, why do you think I fight with you, the Freemasonry, Munanju, and the Shenmen? Where did I get so much information that I could always gain the upper hand? After saying these words, he snorted and shook his head. What I've always wondered is that no one found it strange. When I was in the city of Wei, I used millions of ghosts to form a formation. I dared to use millions of ghosts. Previously in the wilderness forest, I dared to use nearly half of the dead souls. Nearly half of the dead souls. You're a saint, you should know this best. There are some things in this world that shouldn't be touched. At this point, whether it was true or not, Su Sheng could only listen. Then he frowned. On this point, what Li Yunxin said was the truth. Things like souls shouldn't be touched. Of course, this shouldn't be touched was similar to the first commandment of the Shenmen, don't kill mortals unjustly. No one would care if you did something small. But if you did something big, it wouldn't work. Because of this, neither cultivators nor demons dared to wantonly refine souls. Because it was supposed to belong to Black Bai Yanjun. The exact existence of the two Yama kings was both a proof and a deterrent. The two of them proved that there was indeed a powerful existence that stood above humans, the celestial being. It also served as a deterrent to the demons and cultivators in the mortal world. It made them realize that even if they thought of themselves as powerful and omnipotent, matters of life and death were still beyond their control. And now, the person Li Yunxin mentioned was one of these two, Bai Yanjun. Su Sheng said in a low voice, are you saying that the millions of ghosts in the city of Wei were approved by the king of hell? Li Yunxin smiled. What else? Su Sheng was silent for a while. Most people would think that you are a newborn calf who is not afraid of the tiger, so you don't care about this taboo at all. Once Yama Jun blames you in the future, you will be consigned to eternal damnation without needing anyone to do anything. Li Yunxin snorted. You're thinking too much. He pointed to the ground. The reason why I dare to do this is because I have someone down there. I'm not talking nonsense to you about Bai Yanjun today to scare you. He paused and his tone became sincere. You're a sage. You're knowledgeable. If I were to deal with ordinary people, I could come up with a frightening reason to scare them. But against you it's not going to work. So now you should believe that what I'm saying is the truth. When he said these words, his legs were trembling slightly. In fact, they had been trembling slightly just now. Perhaps his legs had just recovered, so they were not able to withstand much force. He was trembling because his body was a little weak. It seemed that because of this, the soles of Li Yunxin's boots were also trembling gently. They kept rubbing against the ground, making a soft but rhythmic sound. He looked at Su Sheng and continued, when Bai Yanjun told me this, the original words were, you only know that there are celestial beings in this world. You think that celestial beings are superior and enjoy immortal happiness forever. You also think that the world is prosperous and orderly. But have you ever thought that celestial beings also have troubles? There are two kinds of troubles for celestial beings. One is an ancient devil and the other is a true devil. When he said these words, he imitated the tone perfectly. Su Sheng and Li Yunxin had been together for a long time. As soon as he heard it, he knew that this was not Li Yunxin's tone. He originally thought that Li Yunxin was deliberately mystifying things. But now, after hearing a lot of news that seemed to be true, he was already a little hesitant in his heart. But at this moment, when he heard this kind of tone, the hesitance swayed to the side of conviction. Then he heard Li Yunxin throw out another bomb. Then you must not have guessed what Bai Yanjun wants me to do. Li Yunxin slowly bent down in front of Su Sheng, squatted down, and looked straight into his eyes. He told me to bring chaos to the world. He told me that it's best to let the strongest forces in the world fight each other, and that most of them die. He also told me that it was true that he used to shepherd people. But of course he also had a purpose in doing so, and it was to prepare for something else. But now, this something else is coming. After so many years, it's time to harvest. Demons, cultivators, and the best of the living beings on earth are the first batch of fruits to be harvested. As for the rest, perhaps they will also be harvested at some point. His gaze was serious and his tone was very low. He carefully observed the changes in Su Sheng's expression, and Su Sheng's expression was indeed not disguised at all. It was really hard for him to conceal it. For example, in Li Yunxin's previous world, if you ran to a person who did not care about worldly affairs and only knew how to live a free and unfettered life, and said that there was an earthquake in the stock market, that person would not feel anything at all and could only reply with an "oh." If you said it to someone who had been immersed in this for a long time, and was involved in it, perhaps there was no need to say it. Instead, he would first pull you along and endlessly complain about his sufferings. The general trend of the world might not be clear to others and they did not care. But Su Sheng should be one of those who knew and cared the most. Now, the words that came out of Li Yunxin's mouth sounded simply alarmist to others. But in Su Sheng's ears, it had a different meaning. After so many years, how could no one have ever had such a question? Why did the Celestials ask the Celestials to shepherd people? Celestials had some similarities with humans. For example, they could also get angry. They would get angry because cultivators did something wrong, and even get angry because cultivators were disrespectful to them. This meant that Celestials also had desires. Since they had desires, it was difficult for the purpose of doing things to be simple. Now that Li Yunxin said such words as raising people for use, it was the words that had been buried deep in the hearts of many cultivators of the Celestial sect, which they did not dare to touch and were unwilling to touch. The expression on Su Sheng's face was full of one word, disbelief. But it was precisely such an expression that meant that he believed everything that Li Yunxin said. So the reincarnation of the master of calligrapher's lips trembled slightly, and for the first time he lost his composure. These things you said, they are all true. Li Yunxin looked at him meaningfully. Otherwise, why would I muddle the water? For myself and also for the words of the Yama King. Because of this, I have to take away all the treasures on the Cloud Mountain. Li Yunxin is already dead. But Li Yunxin's name was left on the floating mountain, and it was empty. So, Li Yunxin had something to do with dragons and demons when he was alive. It was also related to Moon Anju. It was also related to the Celestial sect and the Sage. Because of these relationships, if the Freemasonry wanted to find the treasures and take revenge, they would all be implicated. So, I also did the things that the Yama King asked me to do better. At this point, Su Sheng found it hard to say anything else. He was the reincarnation of the sage. He was born to experience the word love. He was one of the rare existences in the world with extremely high cultivation, but his state of mind was similar to that of ordinary people. Now he met a master like Li Yunxin, who played with people's hearts. How could his state of mind be calm? At this moment, Li Yunxin sighed again, but other than that, the Yama King also told me something else. It's related to you. Su Sheng was stunned and then he frowned. Me? He mentioned me? He mentioned 3 points. Li Yunxin stretched out 3 fingers, ring finger, middle finger, and index finger. The first point, he put down his ring finger. Everything I said is true. Su Sheng was stunned. He blinked quickly and opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. But Li Yunxin quickly put down his middle finger and stared at him. The second point, you believe what I said and fear Bai Yanjun. Therefore you will cooperate with me to take out the magic treasure. Su Sheng's lips trembled slightly, and his eyes blinked even more. Li Yunxin allowed him to do this for a while, then shook his index finger slightly in front of him. The third point, you heard me say forget it? She would forget everything she had just heard. If you remember later and want to say it to others, you will break your own neck. After saying these words, he stood up and let out a long breath. Open the door. Su Sheng sat on the ground, his eyes twitching and blinking very quickly. After a full 10 breaths of time, it was as if something in his mind suddenly issued an order, stop. Then he stood up, glanced at Li Yunxin and slowly but without hesitation, walked to the door of the hall. He chanted some syllables, said some true name talismans, and hand-holding incantations to guide some extremely complicated flow of energy. He calmly did all this and then said in a low voice, open. The door of Qian Hall was finally opened. It's all inside. Su Sheng said slowly to Li Yunxin, looking a little slow. Qian Hall stores the treasures left behind by the past saints. They account for 90% of the magic treasures in Cloud Mountain. There is a silver soul tail ring inside. You can use it with your current cultivation. Put all these treasures in it. But there are a few treasures with special energy. You can't put them in your little finger. You can either leave it here or take it with you. Either way is fine. Su Sheng took care of everything big or small without the slightest reluctance. He was like the most loyal old servant. Chapter 509. In fact, Su Sheng's current state was a little special. He was hypnotized by Li Yunxin. However, hypnosis seemed magical, but the principle behind it might not be so magical. At the end of the day, it was just a matter of avoiding and pushing. Through various means, it narrowed and limited the surface consciousness of the person. It made the person's attention highly concentrated in a narrow area. So it was easier to avoid the person's surface consciousness and sneak into the person's subconscious. This time and many times before, Li Yunxin used sound, light, shadow and movement to attract attention. This was what he wanted. However, when it came to the subconscious, it was just the word pushing. You couldn't make the person do what he resisted. All you could do was guide the thing that existed in the person's subconscious and push him. Maybe the person already had this kind of thought and he himself knew it. Or maybe he already had it but he didn't know it. It was hard to say whether Su Sheng's situation belonged to the former or the latter. He firmly opposed Li Yunxin taking away the treasures of Yunshan. And Li Yunxin entangled with him for a long time, and finally figured out that Su Sheng's resistance was essentially because he cherished the world. He believed that Xianmen would recover one day, so he wanted to leave these treasures in Yunshan for future use. I won't allow Li Yunxin to take them away, was the appearance of this belief but not the essence. So he had to break through this layer of thought. So he said by Yanju. He knew that the former sage must have thought about, why did the Celestials shepherd thousands of people? Since he had thought about it, it was a good entry point. From this point he could make him realize that his hidden worry was real. The Celestials did have other purposes for shepherding thousands of people, and what he said was the truth. Since the great tribulation of Yunshan was inevitable, then it was not safe to leave these treasures here. As long as this seed was planted in his heart. With such a seed he could make his mind waver, and then he could push him a little bit, making him completely lean towards one side. So, thus Su Sheng opened the door to the treasury. However, it was precisely because of this that Su Sheng was able to see many things and remember some things. However, because he was in such a peculiar state he might not be able to realize some other things. For example, there were restrictions in the Qingquan Palace, but there were originally two layers. One was outside, the other inside. Su Sheng's incantation had broken the outer layer of the restriction, so he should have broken the inner restriction as well. However, the two wandering souls had operated in Little Cloud Mountain for 1,000 years, how could they not have their own tricks up their sleeves? Li Yunxin did not know the inside story but Su Sheng should know. However, he clearly knew that there was such a thing. But he just couldn't remember which one it was. He slowly explained the situation in the treasury to Li Yunxin, then frowned. After pondering for a while he still could not remember. In the end he gave up. He only stood on the steps in front of the door, his hands hanging by his sides as he said to Li Yunxin, "Quickly take him away. A long night is fraught with dreams." Li Yunxin looked inside the door. The appearance of the Qingquan Palace was very similar to that of the Dome Hall. However, one side of the Dome Hall was filled with human skin cabinets, while this Qingquan Palace had 3 sides. This layout was slightly out of his expectation. He thought it should be more mystical. Who knew that it looked like a medicine shop? So he took a step inside. Then he was stunned and took another step. He was still in the same place. This was the art of space, one of the most common and widely used Taoist spells and supernatural powers. For example, the road to Little Cloud Mountain, there was no end to it no matter what. For example, when Su Sheng had set up a restriction to trap him, he could not get out no matter what. Compared to a real obstacle, this kind of thing made people unable to break it by force, and it was more brilliant. The two wandering souls added such a layer of restriction in the palace. Before Li Yunxin stepped in, he had already heaved a sigh of relief and relaxed his heart. He had spent so much effort to enter Cloud Mountain, to settle the reincarnation of the Master of Calligrapher, none of which was easy. But now, just as he was about to reach the last step, he bumped into this thing. He sprang to his feet almost at once like an angry cat. He turned to look at Su Sheng, and the murderous look on his face was so thick that it was frightening. "Are you kidding me?" Anyone who was one step away from getting what he wanted would not be able to remain calm. However, at this moment, Su Sheng only raised his eyes to look inside the palace, not caring about Li Yunxin's rage at all. Then he walked past Li Yunxin unhurriedly and took a step into the palace like him. Then he took another step, and another step. After walking for a dozen steps he calmly retreated. He coughed lightly and said to Li Yunxin, "Ah, this thing. It seems that the two wandering souls have set up a new restriction in the palace. Just now I was—" He thought for a moment, careless. "Well, if that's the case," Li Yunxin stared at him. "Ha! I don't have any other way," Su Xing said slowly, and there was even a hint of a smile on his face as if he was just chatting. But in fact it was more like he was calm because his mind was slow. "You must know this kind of technique. It's like the iron lock in the secular world. With the key and the spell it's easy to unlock it. If not, even if you tear down the palace you won't be able to touch it." Hearing this, Li Yunxin was about to lose his temper, but Su Xing said again, "But there's another way." Li Yunxin hated his speed and tone. He gritted his teeth and squeezed out a few words. "Say it. Is to break it with force." Su Xing sighed. "If there's a cultivator who has surpassed the peak of the profound realm, he can also break it. But now you and I can't." Li Yunxin didn't want to listen to him anymore, so he turned around and left. Previously he was very persistent about the magic treasures on Cloud Mountain because he thought there was a way. But now the last bit of hope in his plan was gone. Therefore the more persistent he was before, the more decisive he was now. He never wasted his time on meaningless things. Now the treasures in the floating mountains palaces were already meaningless to him. He walked 5 steps and saw Bai Yunxin and Red Lady. The two demonesses came from the west, one red and one white, walking gracefully. It was actually a beautiful scene. However, Li Yunxin didn't have the mood to enjoy it. His perfect plan was thwarted, so he wasn't in a good mood. If he took away all the treasures and pills, not only would he make the two dead souls frightened and angry, but he could also make the world more chaotic so that he could hide even more. But now he was only halfway done, so he felt very awkward. Therefore he only looked at Bai Yunxin from afar, and his eyes stopped on Red Lady for a while, then he continued walking. The huge square in front of the Chen Hall was illuminated by the sunlight. He was at one end of the square, and the two demonesses were about to step into the square. The ground was slightly hot, and there were occasional breezes and birdsong. If he didn't consider the situation outside and the resentment in his heart, this scene looked very leisurely. Li Yunxin walked another dozen or so steps, slowly dispelling some of the anger and resentment in her heart. Only then did she let out a low sigh and turn to look at Bai Yunxin in the distance, saying loudly, "There's nothing else to do. Do you want to go by yourself or do you want me to bring you? If you want to go with me you have to bring her." As he spoke to this point, he saw Red Lady stop her footsteps. Then Bai Yunxin stopped. So he was stunned. Even when his heart was full of unhappiness, Li Yunxin was still very observant. Who stopped first, and who stopped last actually indicated a very subtle relationship. Because of this detail, he frowned and looked at Red Lady for the second time. The three of them were far apart. If they were mortals they would only be able to hear vaguely if they shouted. But demons had extraordinary hearing and eyesight, so they could still see many details. For example, previously he thought that Bai Yunxin had used some method to stimulate Red Lady's vitality, so that she could move freely for the time being. He wanted to go to the Art Saint again. He wanted to see if there were any immortal flowers, immortal herbs, and immortal fruits that he hadn't destroyed. If he took them temporarily they might be able to prolong the life of this fish demon. He looked like a human but not a human, like a demon but not a demon, but he still had some emotions that were common sense. Little Fish Demon had helped him in the past but never harmed him. Now that she was about to die he had to do something. But at the second glance he saw something unusual. Red Lady still had the appearance of Red Lady. But her temperament had changed. Temperament was an abstract thing, mostly produced by people's subjective consciousness. But some characteristics of the person being observed could also reveal some information. For example, Li Yunxin found that this fish demon was looking at him seriously. It was as if she was seeing him for the first time and wanted to see what kind of person he was. Or maybe she had been familiar with him before and wanted to examine him again. Her face was calm and her limbs were stretched. This meant that her heart was also very calm and confident. What the hell was going on? Li Yunxin turned to look at Bai Yunxin. The look on Bai Yunxin's face was very typical. "I have a lot to say but I don't know how to say it. So Li Yunxin stopped suspiciously and turned around. "You? But Red Lady spoke first. Didn't you want to take the magic weapon? Why did you leave now?" Her tone was still calm and steady. It seemed that she was talking about family matters. Li Yunxin hadn't heard this tone for a long time. In the past, when he talked to her in the wooden pavilion next to the Sanhika Dragon King Temple, she used such a tone. At that time, she was dressed in red, sitting on the railing in the pavilion with her feet hanging down into the dongting. Her voice was clear and cheerful, and there was a faint smile on her face, just like a beautiful girl in the secular world. But since then she seemed to be unhappy. Li Yunxin was shocked by her words. Something abnormal was a demon. This Red Lady was very demon now. But before he could say a second sentence, Red Lady had already turned her head and looked at Su Sheng again. Then let me ask you, what happened? Su Sheng blinked his eyes. Then a slow and soothing smile appeared on his face. Ah. There is an inhibition in this temple. I think you can give it a try. The only holy power of the sage's reincarnation was borrow holy power. This made him more sensitive to qi and wakan than ordinary people. Although his consciousness was sluggish now, it was precisely because he had blocked out a lot of complicated information that his senses were even sharper. He could feel that Red Lady was very strong at the moment. She was the strongest among the four people. Chapter 5:10. However, his mind is dull now. He just knows that she is the strongest. Maybe he feels something is wrong, but if he thinks about it carefully, his attention will wander and jump to other problems. For example, this Red Madam should be able to break the restrictions. Li Yunxin frowns when he hears what she says. He doesn't care about Red Lady's question at all. But now this one, he takes a deep breath and looks at Bai Yunxin. What's the matter? Bai Yunxin is about to speak, but Red Lady turns to look at Li Yunxin. Why don't you ask me? Li Yunxin squints his eyes and is silent for a while. Because I'm afraid I'm not asking you. Red Madam laughed, but her laughter was very strange. In Li Yunxin's eyes, many emotions can be expressed, but happiness is not one of them. I'm here to help you. She slowly withdrew her smile, leaving only a faint trace of it. Let me think about it. My monarch father brought you into Red Flower City. You must have seen him refine me on the fire. Li Yunxin looked at her and said without batting an eyelid, I saw him burn Red Madam on the fire. But she doesn't care what he means. She just blinks. Many people always say that my father treats me harshly. She was not so much a daughter as a servant to be ordered about. I had thought so many times before. But that day in Dongting he said something else to me, before he took you into the Red Flower City. Do you want to hear it? Li Yunxin is expressionless. No. Red Lady tilts her head. Then I want to hear it. I used to be too dependent on you. Hearing her words, Su Sheng seems to think of something and laughs. But his laugh is slow, which makes him look like a retard. Ha! Li Yunxin glares at him. He was considering whether he should immediately say forget to him, then ignore these people and immediately leave Little Cloud Mountain. However, Red Lady's next sentence made him dispel this idea. My monarch father told me that the reason he gave birth to me was for this day. As she spoke, she slowly walked towards the entrance of Qian Hall. Because of this sentence, Li Yunxin stopped in his tracks. What? The reason why he was so sensitive was because Red Lady mentioned Lord Dongting. When he was in the city of Wei, his schemes were always successful. However, in the end he was tricked by that old fish, Lord Dongting, and was trapped in the lake. From this he knew that not all the demons were idiots, there were also many who were scheming. Later on, when he heard that Lord Dongting had suddenly died in the Ruoshui River, killed by Shinryu, he sighed in his heart. But after sighing he felt more relaxed. The death of a shrewd old you could be considered as getting rid of a big problem for him. Even if Lord Dongting's attitude towards him was not hostile. But no one wants to be tricked by others. But now, after hearing Red Lady's words, his heart immediately became alarmed and he thought of another matter. Lord Dongting previously confessed in Red Flower City that the reason why he became intelligent was because he saw the figure of Sword Sage, who was a female cultivator 3,000 years ago, by the side of the water. Because of this, he finally realized the Tao. But later, he brought the dead body of Lu Ling back to Dongting to take her as a concubine. The style of doing that is not what Lord Dongting should do at all. Before, Li Yunxin also had doubts, but he did not take it to heart. He only felt that demons were scheming, but sometimes they would do things that ordinary people could not understand. However, today on Little Cloud Mountain, Su Sheng told him another secret, which made him remember this matter again. That Lu Ling was the reincarnation of Sword Sage. At that time, Lord Dongting inexplicably took away Lu Ling's body. Did he know about this at that time? Li Yunxin always felt that this should be impossible. Lord Dongting should not be so well informed. The reason why he took away Lu Ling was just because he felt that Lu Ling looked familiar. But now Red Lady had said such a thing, his frown deepened, and he gave up on the idea of leaving. What do you mean by that? Red Lady looked at him sideways and smiled. That day my father told me that the reason why I was born more than 300 years ago was actually for the dragon soul. He, after all, wanted to refine the dragon soul into my body. After saying this, she blinked. You Chi-Wen, didn't you also use a similar method to give birth to me? Combining the dragon soul with the demon soul, gave birth to a dragon son. My father had seen Shinryu do it and now he also wants to try it. Li Yunxin was stunned. For a moment he did not know what to say. Because Lord Dongting's courage? Was he really so bold? Dragon soul, this thing should be a taboo thing for Shinryu, right? Shinryu appointed 9 sons, and the 9 sons lived in peace for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. They did not dare to openly devour each other because they were afraid of Shinryu. But Lord Dongting actually dared to directly have the idea of the dragon soul? How dare he? Li Yunxin frowned. Why? Red Lady raised her eyebrows. Don't you understand my father? He is a lover. At this time she had already walked to the front of Qin Hall and stood on the steps. The tone and wording of her speech were very different from the previous Red Lady. The word lover seemed to have a sense of ridicule. The first time you met my father on Mount June, you told him that Longjio was dead. Do you still remember the clouds around him? You should know that was him crying for Longjio. You should also know, other than my father, the rest of the demon fathers of Dragon Sun are all gone. My father once told me that it was because Shinryu killed them all. The reason why they were killed was because they were afraid that those big demons would collude with Dragon Sun and become a force that was not under his control. However, the reason why my father is still alive is because, she paused, those demons, almost all of them are not willing to give up their vitality. And my father, because he loves Shinryu, he is willing to do this thing that will greatly damage his cultivation. Therefore, since he has feelings for Shinryu, he also has feelings for Longjio. A demon who understands affection like my monarch father is really rare in this world. The thoughts in Li Yunxin's mind are turning fast. He frowned again. But when your father was in Red Flower City, he told me that he used to love. He glanced at Su Sheng, the Sage of Sword. Red Lady smiled and shook her head. Think about it. When did he say it? He fell in love with the Sage of Sword 3,000 years ago, and then he helped her descendants to establish the country. After another 700 years he felt tired and cut off that love. After that, Shinryu appeared in the world. He fell in love with Shinryu again. Alas, how many people in this world can be like Hong Yangzi, who only loves one person and never forsakes him? Li Yunxin didn't speak. Red Lady turned around and walked a few steps to the door of Qin Hall, slowly reaching out to feel the door. In fact, it was a void and nothing could be touched. She said while doing so, because my father was so deeply in love, he was trapped in Dongting for 2,000 years and couldn't see Shinryu. Therefore, he missed her so much that he almost went crazy. So, he suddenly had a bold idea. He really wanted to create another person like Shinryu. In this world, half of the dragon souls are in Dongting. He also saw Shinryu refining Dragon Sun with the dragon soul and demon's vitality, so he probably wanted to do the same. So he gave birth to me. Red Lady paused and said, people said that he gave birth to me just to use me. In this case it's not fake. I'm just a fish spirit. I'm not the person he wants. Therefore, in the hundreds of years when he hesitated, I was always a role that didn't matter whether I existed or not. Then 200 years ago, he had studied the method of refining the dragon soul for 200 years, he knew that I couldn't live. He said that I had to die first and become a ghost cultivator so that there would be a gap in the remnant soul and it would be easy to stick to the dragon soul. So I died. Red Lady was silent for a while. No one knew what she was thinking. Then she sighed, later I became a ghost cultivator. Later hatred came to Dongting. My father said that he forged the order of Shinryu. Shinryu might have changed. There has been no news about Shinryu in the past 2,000 years. My father has been worried. He was worried that she had encountered some disaster. Therefore, when the thing about hatred came out, his worry was so strong. So, he finally refined the dragon soul in me. He said that he wanted to see Shinryu. And he wanted me to do one thing in Mount Shaoyan. If he went to Shinryu and was safe, I would put this matter aside. If he died, it meant that his prediction came true. Maybe Shinryu encountered a strong enemy and even he couldn't escape. So, I had to be prepared. Red Madam let out another sigh. After all these things, Everyone knows that I have a dragon soul in my body. They all knew that I had no ability to protect myself. They all wanted to catch me. But in the end it must be Xianmen who caught me. Because at least for now, there is no power stronger than them in the world. He trapped you and me in Dongting so that the people of Xianmen could catch us. But he didn't expect that you were so clever that you could break that trap. But in the end, things are still the way they should be until today. Speaking till here, Red Lady heaved a sigh of relief. Then, some changes happened to her body. 2 dots of red light lit up on her forehead, as if 2 horns had just sprouted. Li Yunxin's face was gloomy when he heard this. He just stared at Red Lady and said in a deep voice, "But it seems that your father didn't fully understand the method of Shinryu to refine Dragon Son. You had to die once to merge with the Dragon Soul. So now you are Red Lady who has merged with the Dragon Soul. No wonder your temperament changed so much." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.